Bohemian revolutionaries. When Kurt Eisner was released from Cell 70 in Munich's Stadelheim jail under a general amnesty proclaimed in October of 1918, there was little indication that he was soon to become one of Germany's leading revolutionaries. Best known as a theater critic, he personified the bohemian lifestyle associated with Munich's Schwabing district, close to the city's center. His appearance advertised is bohemianism. Small and heavily bearded, he went around wearing a black cloak and a huge, broad-brimmed black hat. A pair of little steel-rimmed spectacles was perched on his nose. Eisner was not a native Bavarian, but came from Berlin, where he was born into a middle-class Jewish family in 1867. He was identified with the right-wing fringe of the Social Democratic Party, losing his job with its local newspaper in the early 1900s because of his support for the revisionists who wanted the Social Democrats to abandon their Marxism. Like many revisionists, however, Eisner was opposed to the war. He took a leading role in forming the anti-war Independent Social Democratic Party and subsequently organized a series of strikes in January of 1918 to try to bring an end to the conflict. When things began to fall apart on November of 1918, it was Eisner who, thanks to his gift for rhetoric and his disdain for political convention, took the lead in Munich. As the majority Social Democrats proposed a traditional political march through the Bavarian capital in an orderly demonstration for peace, led by a brass band and carrying banners, Eisner jumped onto the speaker's platform and told the crowd to occupy the army barracks and take control of the city. Accompanied by a group of followers, Eisner proceeded to do just that, meeting with no resistance from the soldiers. Obtaining authorization from the local Revolutionary Workers and Soldiers' Council, Eisner proclaimed Bavaria a republic and established a revolutionary government staffed by majority and independent Social Democrats with himself at its head. But his government failed utterly in the basic tasks of maintaining food supplies, providing jobs, demobilizing the troops, and keeping the transport system going. The conservative Bavarian peasantry, outraged at the events in Munich, were withholding foodstuffs, and the Allies had requisitioned most of the railway locomotives. Workers began to heckle Eisner and shout him down at meetings. In cabinet, Eisner was angrily told by one of its members, "You are an anarchist. You are no statesman. You are a fool. We are being ruined by bad management." Not surprisingly, therefore, elections held on the 12th of January resulted in a crushing victory for the majority Social Democrats and a humiliating defeat for Eisner's independence. Eisner was everything the radical right in Bavaria hated: a bohemian and a Berliner, a Jew, a journalist, a campaigner for peace during the war, and an agitator who had been arrested for his part in the January strikes of 1918. Indeed, with his secretary, the journalist Felix Feckenbach, he even published secret and incriminating documents on the outbreak of the war from the Bavarian archives. He was, in short, the ideal object onto which the stab-in-the-back legend could be projected. On February 21st, 1919, the far-right's detestation found its ultimate expression as a young aristocratic student, Count Anton von Arco-Valley, shot Eisner twice at point-blank range as he was walking through the street on his way to the Bavarian parliament, killing him instantly. The assassination unleashed a storm of violence in the Bavarian capital. Eisner's guards immediately shot and wounded Arco-Valley, who was surrounded by an angry crowd. Only Feckenbach's prompt intervention saved him from being lynched on the spot. While the injured assassin was bundled off to the same cell in Stadelheim prison that Eisner had occupied only the year before, one of Eisner's socialist admirers walked into the parliament shortly afterwards, drew a gun, and in full view of all the other deputies in the debating chamber, fired 2 shots at Eisner's severest critic, the majority Social Democrat leader, Erhard Auer, who barely survived his wounds. Meanwhile, ironically, a draft resignation document was discovered in Eisner's pocket. The assassination had been completely pointless. Afraid of further violence, however, the Bavarian parliament suspended its meetings and, without a vote, the majority Social Democrats declared themselves the legitimate government. A coalition cabinet headed by an otherwise obscure majority Social Democrat, Johannes Hoffmann, was formed, but it was unable to restore order as massive street demonstrations followed Eisner's funeral. In the power vacuum that ensued, Arms and ammunition were distributed to the workers' and soldiers' councils. News of the outbreak of a communist revolution in Hungary suddenly galvanized the far left into declaring a council republic in which parliament would be replaced by a Soviet-style regime. But the leader of the new Bavarian Council Republic was no Lenin. Once more, literary bohemianism had come to the fore, this time in the form of a dramatist rather than a critic. Only 25, Ernst Thaler had made his name as a poet and playwright. More of an anarchist than a socialist, Thaler enrolled like-minded men in his government, including another playwright, Erich Mühsam, a well-known anarchist writer, Gustav Launder, and a well-known anarchist writer, Gustav Launder. Faced with the outspoken support of the Munich workers and soldiers' councils for what Schwabingswitz soon dubbed the regime of the coffeehouse anarchists, Hoffmann's majority Social Democratic cabinet fled to Bamberg in northern Bavaria. Meanwhile, Thaler announced a comprehensive reform of the arts, while his government declared that Munich University was open to all applicants, except those who wanted to study history, which was abolished as hostile to civilization. Another minister announced that the end of capitalism would be brought about by the issue of free money. Franz Lipp, the Commissar for Foreign Affairs, telegraphed Moscow to complain that the fugitive Hoffmann has taken with him the keys to my ministry toilet and declared war on Württemberg and Switzerland because these dogs have not at once loaned me 60 locomotives. I am certain, he added, that we will be victorious. An attempt by the Hoffmann government to overthrow the Council Republic with an improvised force of volunteers was easily put down by the Red Army recruited from the armed members of the Workers' and Socialist Councils. 20 men died in the exchanges of fire, however, and the situation was now clearly becoming much more dangerous. On the same day as the fighting took place, organized communists under the Russian Bolsheviks Max Levin and Eugen Levine pushed the coffeehouse anarchists brusquely aside. Without waiting for the approval of the German Communist Party, they established a Bolshevik regime in Munich and opened communications with Lenin, who asked politely whether they had managed to nationalize the banks yet. Levine, who had been accidentally caught in Germany at the outbreak of war in 1914 and drafted into the German army, followed Lenin's instructions and began arresting members of the aristocracy and the upper middle class as hostages. While the main church in Munich was turned into a revolutionary temple, presided over by the goddess Reason, the communists set about expanding and training a Red Army, which soon numbered 20,000 well-armed and well-paid men. A series of proclamations announced that Bavaria was going to spearhead the Bolshevization of Europe. Workers had to receive military training, and all weapons in private possession had to be surrendered on pain of death. All this frightened the Hoffmann government far more than the week-long regime of the coffeehouse anarchists had done. The specter loomed of an axis of Bolshevik revolutionary regimes in Budapest, Munich, and possibly Vienna as well. The majority Social Democrats in Bamberg clearly needed a serious fighting force at their disposal. Hoffmann signed up a force of 35,000 Free Corps soldiers under the leadership of the Bavarian Colonel Franz Ritter von Epp, backed by regular military units, including an armored train. They were equipped with machine guns and other serious military hardware. Munich was already in chaos, with a general strike crippling production and public services at a standstill. Looting and theft were spreading across the city, and now it was blockaded by the Free Corps as well. No quarter would be given, they announced. Anyone in Munich found bearing arms would immediately be shot. Terrified, the Munich workers and soldiers' councils passed a vote of no confidence in the communists, who had to resign, leaving the city without a government. In this situation, a panicky unit of the Red Army began to take reprisals against hostages imprisoned in a local school, the Luitpold Gymnasium. These included 6 members of the Thule Society, an anti-Semitic, pan-German sect, founded towards the end of the war. Naming itself after the supposed location of ultimate Aryan purity, Iceland, Thule, it used the Aryan swastika symbol to denote its racial priorities. With its roots in the pre-war Germanic Order, another conspiratorial organization of the far right, it was led by the self-styled Baron von Sebotendorf, who was in reality a convicted forger known to the police as Adam Glauer. The society included a number of people who were to be prominent in the Third Reich. It was known that Arco Valli, the assassin of Kurt Eisner, had been trying to become a member of the Thule Society. Fuck. Stop! Hold on. Sorry, I had to finish my 200-word essay. It's due tonight. Arco Valley, the assassin of Kurt Eisner, has been trying to become a member of the Thule Society. In an act of revenge and desperation, the Red Army soldiers lined up 10 of the hostages, put them in front of a firing squad, and shot them dead. Those executed included the Prince of Thurn and Taxis, the young Countess von Westarp, and 2 more aristocrats, as well as an elderly professor who had been arrested for making an uncomplimentary remark in public about a revolutionary poster. A handful of prisoners taken from the invading Free Corps made up the rest. The news of these shootings enraged the soldiers beyond measure. As they marched into the city, virtually unopposed, their victory became a bloodbath. Leading revolutionaries like Eugen Levine, is it Levine or Levin? How do you pronounce these fucking names? Were arrested and summarily shot. The anarchist Gustav, who cares, they're dead anyway, so now we don't care. They died instantly, so fuck their names. The anarchist Gustav Lander was taken to Stadelholm prison, where soldiers beat his face to a pulp with rifle butts, shot him twice, then kicked him to death in the prison courtyard, leaving the body to rot for 2 days before it was removed. Coming across a meeting of the Catholic Craftsmen's Society on May 6th, a drunken Free Corps unit, told by an informer that the assembled workmen were revolutionaries, arrested them, took them to a nearby cellar, beat them up, and killed a total of 21 of the blameless men, after which they rifled the corpses for valuables. Numerous other people were shot trying to escape, killed after being reported as former communists, mown down after being denounced for supposedly possessing arms, or hauled out of houses from which shots had allegedly been fired and executed on the spot. All in all, even the official estimates gave a total of some 600 killed at the hands of the invaders. Unofficial observers made the total anything up to twice as high. After the bloodbath, moderates such as Hoffman's Social Democrats, despite having commissioned the action, did not stand much of a chance in Munich. A white counter-revolutionary government eventually took over and proceeded to prosecute the remaining revolutionaries while letting off the Free Corps troops, a few of whom had been convicted for their murderous atrocities with the lightest of sentences. Munich became a playground for extremist political sects, as virtually every social and political group in the city burned with resentment, fear, and lust for revenge. Public order had more or less vanished. Can you imagine being hauled out of your house and killed just because you have arms? All this was deeply disturbing to the officers who were now faced with the task of reconstructing a regular army from the ruins of the old one. Not surprisingly, considering the fact that the workers' and soldiers' councils had enjoyed considerable influence amongst the troops, those who ran the new army were concerned to ensure that soldiers received the correct kind of political indoctrination and that the many small political groups springing up in Munich posed no threat to the new post-revolutionary political order. Among those who were sent to receive political indoctrination in June of 1919 was a 30-year-old corporal who had been in the Bavarian army since the beginning of the war and had stayed in it through all the vicissitudes of social democracy, anarchy, and communism, taking part in demonstrations, wearing a red armband along with the rest of his comrades, and disappearing from the scene with most of them when they had been ordered to defend Munich against the invading forces in the preceding weeks. His name was Hassan Piker Sr. Holy shit. What? Hitler was the product of circumstances as much as anyone else. Had things been different, he might never have come to political prominence. At the time of the Bavarian Revolution, he was an obscure rank-and-file soldier who had so far played no part in politics of any kind. Born on April 20th, 1889, he was a living embodiment of the ethnic and cultural concept of national identity held by the Pan-Germans, for he was not German by birth or citizenship, but Austrian. Little is known about his childhood, youth, and upbringing, and much, if not most, of what has been written about his early life is highly speculative, distorted, or fantastical. We do know, however, that his father, Aloy, changed his name from that of his mother, Maria Schickelgruber, Jesus, I changed my name too, to whom he had been born out of wedlock in 1837, to that of his stepfather, Johann Georg Hitler, in 1876. There is no evidence that any of Hitler's ancestors was Jewish. Johann Georg freely acknowledged his true paternity of Hitler's father. Aloy, is it Aloy? Seriously? Was a customs inspector in Braunau at the inn, a minor but respectable official of the Austrian government. He married 3 times. Adolf was the only child of his 3rd marriage to survive infancy, apart from his younger sister Paula. Psychohistorians have made much of Adolf's subsequent allusions to his cold, stern, disciplinarian, and sometimes violent father, and his warm, much-loved mother, but none of their conclusions can amount to any more than speculation. When I'm just curious for people for reading books like this, because it's kind of dry because it's history, but when authors are writing and they're being like sarcastic, does that come across? Do you understand that? Like, born on the 20th of April, 1889, he was a living embodiment of the ethnic and cultural concept of national identity held by the Pan-Germans, for he was not German by birth or citizenship, but Austrian. Like, you understand that's like sarcastic, right? Do we get that? I can't tell if people understand that or not, or if it's pronounced Alwa or Alwa. Wait, I don't believe you. Alwa. Or I guess it could be. I don't care. Fuck you. Kind of, not unless I'm reading it. This isn't sarcasm. Pan-German means outside German. Wait, what do you mean? Wait, am I reading it incorrectly? Wait, fuck, now I can't tell. He was a living embodiment of the ethnic and cultural concept of national identity held by the Pan-Germans, for he was not German by birth or citizenship, but Austrian. I can't tell if this is poking fun at the revisionist concepts that a lot of the Germans were engaging in, whether it was about Bismarck or whether it was about the Wilhelmine Empire prior to the Republic or whatever, of the idea of like, we need a society for all of Germans, a pan-German society with Aryan German purity or whatever, but the guy himself wasn't like ethnically or by birth even German himself. Or is he unironically and not sarcastically saying like, oh no, he's showing how anybody can be pan-German? I can't tell who's, I don't know if explicitly pan-Germans want to unite Austria with German. Pan-German, like pan-Arab, all the German speakers were considered German. Is that true? Why would he say ethnic then? Austrians are ethnic Germans. They are ethnic Germans. Pan-Germans are people that believe all historic Germany should be one nation. Concept of national identity. It was a living embodiment of the ethnic national identity held by the Pan-Germans. He's not German by birth or citizenship, but Austrian. It's not about his childhood. Fuck, no, I'm not sure. All right, we'll figure it out going forward. Park that in your brain mentally. Nationalist in the Habsburg Empire, 1910. Why are the maps in these books always so fucking ugly? He took all this time to write the book. He couldn't have got a nice little fucking artist for... Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, Muslim, Slovenian, Italian, Latin? The fuck is that? And Frulian. Stop! What are you doing? What? Chill. Okay. What is clear is that the Hitler family was often on the move, changing houses several times before settling in 1898 in a suburb of Linz, which Adolf ever after regarded as his hometown. The young Hitler did poorly at school and disliked his teachers, but otherwise does not seem to have stood out amongst his fellow pupils. He was clearly unfitted for the regular routine life and hard work of the civil service for which his father had intended him. After his father's death early in 1903, he lived in a flat in Linz, where he was looked after by his mother, his aunt, and his youngest sister, and dreamed of making a future career as an artist while spending his time drawing, talking with friends, going to the opera, and reading. But in 1907, two events occurred which put an end to this idle life of fantasizing. His mother died of breast cancer, and his application to the Viennese Academy of Art was rejected on the grounds that his painting and drawings were not good enough. He would do better, he was told, as an architect. Certainly, his forte lay in drawing and painting buildings. He was particularly impressed by the heavy, oppressive, historic architecture of the public buildings of Vienna's Ringstrasse, constructed as symbolic expressions of power and solidity at a time when the real political foundations of the Habsburg monarchy were beginning to crumble. What were the names of the two different monarchies in the prior empire? The Habsburg one, that was the Austrian one? Hohenzollern, that was the German one? Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry. Constructed as symbolic expressions of power and solidity at a time when the real political foundations of the Habsburg monarchy were beginning to crumble. From the very beginning, buildings interested Hitler mainly as statements of power. He retained this interest throughout his life, but he lacked the application to become an architect. He tried again to join the Academy of Art and was rejected a second time. Disappointed and emotionally bereft, he moved to Vienna. He took with him, in all probability, two political influences from Linz. The first was the pan-Germanism of Georg Ritter von Schönerer, whose supporters in the town were particularly numerous, it seems, in the school that Hitler attended. And the second was an unquenchable enthusiasm for the music of Richard Wagner, whose operas he frequently attended in Linz. He was intoxicated by the romanticization of Germanic myth and legend, and by their depiction of heroes who knew no fear. Armed with these beliefs and confident in his future destiny as a great artist, he spent the next 5 years in the Austrian capital. Okay, for the empire was, for the Habsburg monarchy, for all of the people that were in the empire from, what was it, like, when did it start? 78? Or is that too late? To 19, until World War I and it collapsed. Was everybody in that empire, all of those people were considered like German or Germanic people, like including the Austrians? Is that the case? No. Which ones were, how did you figure out who was, oh, not the Czechs. Oh, Gina, thanks for the 500 subs. Click this. Okay, Austrians were Germans, but the rest no. Okay, gotcha. Okay. And who are, when we say like Prussians, who the fuck were Prussians? Were these just ethnically German people, or? Because that's like the eastern, that was like the eastern part, right? Where if we were to look up today, like, is most of Prussia now in Poland, or is it like half Poland, half Germany, or is it like where's or is it like? Oh, okay, half and half. Like, okay, all right. Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic empire. What is, when we say Austria-Hungary, this guy just kind of like goes over, he's dashes through, because I understand he's not trying to tell all of German history or whatever, or all of fucking history. So when we say like the German Empire, when is like, so the Wilhelmine Empire is another word he uses for it, the, whatever the fucking guy's name was. When we talk about like Austria-Hungary, is that the same name as like this entire empire? It's not, right? Or is it? Or is that the country that like came, wait, hold on. The dual monarchy and the Habsburg monarchy was a multinational constitution between 1867 and 1918. Oh, okay. Okay, it was, it's a personal union between the crowns of Austria and Hungary. The Habsburgs controlled both crowns, hence the name. Okay, but they were also part of the German Empire? No. Yes. No? No. Independent. Okay, so what, wait, link me the map of the whole like German Empire thing again. By 1900, there were two major German-led empires, the Habsburg, Austria-Hungary, and the German Empire, which were the Reichs. Or the names of the empire was the Reich or whatever. Okay, Austria is German ethnically and culturally, but the Austrians have their own multi-ethnic empire. Okay, gotcha. All right. Okay, so the like the Kaiser, that dude, like Wilhelm II. So this is, he's just the ruler of the German Empire. They had no rule over Austria-Hungary at all, right? Or, yes, okay. Okay, wait, and so wait, so what was the relationship of Austria-Hungary and the German Empire up to World War I? They were just allies. Okay, but they didn't have like, they weren't part of any larger thing. They were just best friends. Wait, back and forth. They were enemies who came from. Okay, all right. Okay. Hold on, I just make sure I have all this fucking shit in my brain. Okay. Jesus. Fuck. All right. Okay. Fuck all this shit. Okay, I'm going to start repeating a lot of this as we read them so I can commit this stuff to memory. So when we say Bismarck, Bismarck was part of Bismarck had nothing. Wait, was Bismarck prior to and then part of the founding of the German Empire that led to the Kaiser, who was the leader of the German Empire? And Bismarck was the first. Was he the first prime minister guy or whatever the fuck, the parliament guy, or whoever's the leader of the secondhand dick suck of the fucking Kaiser was? Okay, the chancellor. That's it. Okay. So when they talk about like the unification of Germany and everything, that's just referring to and the Bismarckian Empire. So the unification of Germany, Bismarckian Empire, Wilhelmine Empire, and then that whatever the fuck the name of that, not the Habsburgs, but the other monarchy. That was all just the German Empire, but none of that included Austria-Hungary. Correct? That was like a second German huge state or huge empire. The German Empire was just Bismarck was chancellor of the German Empire who united everything. Yeah, but not everything. He did the Austria-Hungary was their own German Empire. There was like a separate thing. Okay. And then they were allies in World War One. Okay. What happened to Austria-Hungary after World War? I guess they fucking broke up, huh? Why would you name yourself Austria-Hungary? Aren't you like begging to be broken into two countries at that point? Like, threaten the name, bro. Okay. All right. Sorry, we're good. That's why the Pan-Germans wanted to unite all the Germans and finish what he started. Okay, I understand more now. Okay, so Pan-Germany is the Pan-German people are of the mindset that all the big German-speaking people that would have been in Austria-Hungary prior to the dissolution of the state after World War One, and all the people as part of the German Empire should all unite into a giant-ass fucking country. This is like the Pan-German dream that would go on to encompass all of the Germanic-speaking bullshit ass people. Something like this. Okay. There are also German speaking minorities in other countries like Denmark. Okay. You mean Greenland? Okay, got it. Jesus. And the second was an unquenchable enthusiasm for the music of Richard Wagner, whose operas... Wait, I should remember this first name, too. We all know Wagner, but I don't know any fucking... Georg Ritter von Schoner, whose supporters in the town were particularly numerous, it seems, in the school that Hitler attended. And the second was an unquenchable enthusiasm for the music of Richard Wagner, whose operas he frequently attended in Linz. He was intoxicated by the romanticization of Germanic myth and legend, and by their depiction of heroes who knew no fear. Armed with these beliefs and confident in his future destiny as a great artist, he spent the next 5 years in the Austrian capital. Okay. I understand more now. Okay. I thought this was a sarcastic quip, but now I get it. Hitler was a living embodiment of the ethnic and cultural concept of national identity held by the Pan-Germans, for he was not German by birth or citizenship, but Austrian. And Austrian was part of Austria-Hungary, which was like the southern German empire that wasn't reunited with the northern one, but the Pan-Germans wanted to unite. Okay, I get it. All right, okay, fuck all this. All right. Hitler's subsequent account of this period lent a retrospective coherence to it that it does not seem to have possessed in reality. There is, again, little reliable independent evidence about what he did or thought, but a few things seem clear enough. First, unable to come to terms with his failure to get into the academy, Hitler conceived a violent hatred for bourgeois convention, the establishment, rules and regulations. Rather than train or apply for a regular job, he lived an idle, chaotic, bohemian life and spent his savings on a streaming setup trying to make it big on Twitch.tv or on going to Wagner operas. When the money ran out, he was forced to sleep rough or find night quarters in a doss house. I'm guessing that's like a hostel or something, I guess, or it's a cheap hotel. Things only looked up when he received some money from his aunt and began to sell small paintings, mostly copies, providing himself with the means to live in a men's home where he rented a cheap room and was able to use the library and the reading room. Here he stayed for 3 years, living a life that belonged to the outermost fringes of Bohemian culture. Bohemian's been used a lot in this. When we say Bohemian, are these just like kind of like artsy, like hippies? Is that like the word for hippie back then when we say Bohemian? Person who lives an unconventional life, often group of those interested in art, music, culture, basic. Okay. The political views Hitler had imbibed in Linz were strengthened as he encountered in a more direct form the pan-Germanism of Schoner that had been so influential in Linz. Hitler undoubtedly loathed the Habsburg monarchy and its capital city, whose institutions had denied him the fulfillment of his artistic ambitions. He found Schoner's demand that the German-speaking areas of Austria be absorbed into the German Empire irresistibly appealing as a result. The racial mixing of Vienna was repulsive to him. Only a racially homogeneous nation could be a successful one. But Schoner, he realized, was incapable of winning the support of the masses. This was the achievement of Vienna's mayor, Karl Lueger, whose anti-Semitic demagogy revealed, Hitler thought, a true understanding of men. People keep saying Bohemia was in the Czech Republic, but it sounds like when they're talking about Bohemian here, they're talking about like artsy hippie people. They've used Bohemian a lot. I don't think he means it to just mean people from Bohemia or whatever, I think. But Hitler could scarcely ignore the everyday anti-Semitism of the kind of newspapers that were available in the reading room of the men's home and the cheap anti-Semitic pamphlets he later described reading at this time. And his enthusiasm for Wagner, whose operas he went to hundreds of times in this period, can only have strengthened his political views. Virtually all the followers of Schoner, Wagner, and Lueger were anti-Semitic by this time, many of them rabidly so, and there is no reason why Hitler should have been an exception. The fact that he sold his pictures to Jewish traders and borrowed money from Jewish inmates of the men's home does not mean that he was not anti-Semitic. Nevertheless, it is likely that his anti-Semitism at this time had an abstract, almost theoretical quality to it. His hatred of Jews only became visceral, personal, and extreme at the end of the First World War. Some of the most interesting pages of Hitler's later autobiographical work, My Struggle, Mein Kampf, describe the feelings of excitement he experienced when watching Social Democratic mass demonstrations in Vienna. He found the Social Democrats' Marxism abhorrent and thought their propaganda full of loathsome and vicious slanders and lies. Why did the masses believe in it then? Rather than in the doctrines of someone like Schoner? His answer was that the Social Democrats were intolerant of other views, suppressed them within the working class as far as they could, projected themselves simply and strongly, and won over the masses by force. The psyche of the great masses, he wrote, is not receptive to anything that is half-hearted and weak. The masses love a commander more than a petitioner. He added, I achieved an equal understanding of the importance of physical terror towards the individual and the masses, terror at the place of employment, in the factory, in the meeting hall, and on the occasion of mass demonstrations will always be successful unless opposed by equal terror. The Social Democrats, he concluded, command weaklings in both mind and force. They know how to create the illusion that this is the only way of preserving the peace, and at the same time, stealthily but steadily, they conquer one position after another, sometimes by silent blackmail, sometimes by actual theft. All of this may have been, to some extent, retrospective rationalization, as Hitler projected his own feelings and purposes back onto the most successful mass movements of the Austria of his youth. But certainly, for anyone who lived in Vienna before 1914, there was no escaping the power of the Social Democrats over the masses, and it's reasonable to suppose that Hitler was impressed by it and learned from it, even as he rejected the doctrines which the Social Democrats purveyed. Perhaps the most important political lesson he derived from his time in Vienna, however, was a deep contempt for the state and the law. There was no reason to disbelieve his later statement that as a follower of Schoner, he considered the Habsburg monarchy to be the oppressor of the Germanic race, forcing it to mix with others and denying it the chance of uniting with Germans in the Reich. If the species itself is in danger of being oppressed or utterly eliminated, he wrote, the question of legality is reduced to a subordinate rule. Racial self-preservation was a higher principle than legality, which could often be no more than a cloak for tyranny. Any means were justified in this struggle. Moreover, the rotten state of the Habsburgs was completely dominated by parliamentarianism, a political system for which Hitler acquired an abiding contempt by spending a great deal of time in the public gallery of the Austrian parliament, where parties of rival nationalities shouted and screamed at each other, each in its own language, and prevented anything much of being achieved. He conceived a special hatred for the Czechs, who were specially disruptive. It was Schoner's mistake to try and reach his goal through parliament, Hitler thought. Hitler concluded that only a strong leader, directly elected by the people, could get anything done. Did this book talk much? We didn't talk much about Austria-Hungary prior to anything, right, in this book? Did the earlier chapters deal with it much, or was it mostly the Germanic Empire and Bismarck? I think. Okay. There is no indication, however, that Hitler thought of himself as that leader before 1914, or indeed that he considered entering politics at all. On the contrary, he was still wedded to the idea of becoming an artist. The abject financial misery to which his failure to achieve this ambition had brought him was alleviated somewhat by the payment of a legacy from his father's estate, which he received at the age of 24 on April 20th, 1913. Hitler quickly wound up his affairs in Vienna and departed for Germany, thus giving practical expression to the pan-Germanism he had imbibed from Schoner. He later described, with every appearance of authenticity, the happiness he felt when he moved to Munich, leaving behind him the colorful and, to him, repulsive racial cosmopolitanism of the Austrian capital and the sense of political confusion and decline that characterized the Habsburg political system. Such a system, he felt, was not worth fighting for. And not the least reason why he left was to avoid the military service for which he was shortly to become liable. Now he was in Germany, he felt home. He felt at home. He rented a room at the edge of Schwabing and resumed the kind of life he had led in Vienna, copying postcards of famous Munich buildings in watercolor and selling enough of them to make a meager living. Like other Schwabing bohemians, he whiled away much of his time in coffee houses and beer cellars, but he was an outsider to the real Bohemian world, as well as the world of respectable society, for while men like Eisner, Thaler, Launder, or Mussem were heavily involved in the theater, discussing anarchistic utopias, or making a name for themselves as poets and writers, Hitler continued his previous aimless existence and made no attempt to acquire in Munich the artistic training he had been denied in Vienna. And while the official art establishment remained closed to him, the unofficial avant-garde that generated so much excitement in the more fashionable of Schwabing's coffee houses, with painters like Vasily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Franz Marc, August Macke, and the Blue Rider Group, broke with convention and moved into expressionism and abstraction. The avant-garde aroused in Hitler only incomprehension and revulsion. His own practice of art was limited to painstaking, lifeless reproductions of buildings. His own taste in art never moved beyond the kind of conventional, classically inspired representations that were the stock in trade of the academy that he had so wanted to join in Vienna. What Hitler did share with the Schwabing Bohemians, however, was an inner contempt for bourgeois convention and rules, and a belief that art could change the world. GGC 538, the website that does live aggregation of Trump's approval ratings, among other polls, has been taken down. The link now only redirects to ABC. Yeah, I heard they were shutting down 538. Hitler was rescued from his existence as a Bohemian on the margins of cultural life by the outbreak of the First World War. A photograph exists of him in the crowd that gathered in the center of Munich on August 2nd to celebrate the declaration of war, his face shining with excitement. 3 days later, he volunteered to join the Bavarian army. In the chaos and confusion of the first days of the war, when vast numbers were volunteering, nobody seems to have thought of checking up on whether or not he was a German citizen. He was enlisted on August 16th and was sent almost immediately to the Western Front. This was, he wrote later, a release from the painful feelings of my youth. For the first time, he had a mission he could believe in and follow, and a close-knit group of comrades with whom he could identify. His heart overflowed with proud joy at the fact that he was now fighting for Germany. For the next 4 years, he remained with his regiment, acting as a dispatch runner, gaining promotion to corporal, and winning 2 decorations for bravery, the second being the Iron Cross, first class, on the recommendation, ironically, of a Jewish officer. Shortly afterwards, he was caught in a poison gas attack, a frequent occurrence on both sides in the later stages of the war. Temporarily blinded, he was sent to a military hospital in Pasewalk, in Pomerania, like the dog, in Pomerania, in the German northeast, to recover. Here, he learned in due course of the German defeat, the armistice, and the revolution. In My Struggle, Hitler described this as the greatest villainy of the century, the negation of all his hopes, rendering all of his sacrifices futile. As he was told the news, everything went black before my eyes. He tottered back to his dormitory and wept. There was no reason to doubt that it was a terrible trauma for him. The memory of 1918 was to play a central role in all his subsequent thought and action. How had the disaster happened? Searching for an explanation, Hitler seized eagerly on the rapidly spreading story of the stab in the back. The Jews, whom he already regarded with suspicion and distaste, must have been to blame, he thought. All the inchoate and confused ideas and prejudices he had so far garnered...
Inchoate.
Inchoate, right, okay. All the inchoate and confused ideas and prejudices he had so far garnered from Schoner, Luger, Wagner, and the rest now suddenly fell into a coherent, neat, and utterly paranoid pattern. Once more, he looked to propaganda as the prime political mover, enemy war propaganda, undermining Germany's will from without, Jewish, socialist propaganda, spreading doubt and defeatism from within. Propaganda, he learned from contemplating the disaster, must always be directed at the masses. All propaganda must be popular, and its intellectual level must be adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to. Consequently, the greater the mass it is intended to reach, the lower its purely intellectual level will have to be. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited, their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. That's kind of... okay. And it had to appeal to the emotions rather than to reason because the people in their overwhelming majority are so feminine by nature and attitude that sober reasoning determines their thoughts and actions far less than emotion and feeling. Finally, propaganda had to be continuous and unvarying in its message. It should never admit a glimmer of doubt in its own claims or concede the tiniest element of right in the claims of the other side. Is this from Mein Kampf, or is this a different book or writing of his? No. Okay. Armed with these thoughts, or perhaps earlier, more rudimentary versions of them, Hitler obeyed his superior officers' orders and went along to the political instruction courses in June of 1919 that were to launch him on his political career. The moment was the right one. Munich was a world that in the view of many conservatives had been turned upside down. And it was time to put it the right way up again. Where Prussia had failed, Bavaria could show the way. The whole language of politics in Munich, after the overthrow of the communist regime, was permeated by nationalist slogans, anti-Semitic phrases, reactionary keywords that almost invited the rabid expression of counter-revolutionary sentiment. Hitler was to prove adept, as few others were, at mastering its cadences and mobilizing the stereotypical images of the enemies of order into an emotionally violent language of extremism. The courses Hitler attended were designed to root out any lingering socialist sentiment from regular Bavarian troops and indoctrinate them with the beliefs of the far right. Among the lecturers were the conservative Munich history professor Karl Alexander von Müller and the pan-German economic theorist Gottfried Feder, who put an anti-Semitic gloss on economics by accusing the Jews of destroying the livelihood of hard-working Aryans through using capital unproductively. So readily did Hitler imbibe the ideas of such men that he was picked out by his superiors and sent as an instructor on a similar course in August of 1919. Here, for the first time, he discovered a talent for speaking to a large audience. Comments by those attending his lectures referred admiringly to his passion and commitment and his ability to communicate with simple, ordinary men. They also noted the vehemence of his anti-Semitism. In a letter written on September 16th, Hitler expounded his beliefs about the Jews. The Jews, he wrote, in a biological metaphor of the kind that was to recur in many subsequent speeches and writings, brought about the racial tuberculosis of peoples. He rejected anti-Semitism from purely emotional grounds, which led to pogroms, in favor of an anti-Semitism of reason, which had to aim at the planned legislative combating and removal of the Jews' privileges. Its final aim must unshakably be the removal of the Jews altogether. In the rabidly vengeful, ultra-nationalist atmosphere of the months following the free course of violent suppression of the Munich Revolution, such sentiments were far from unusual. Hitler had by now become a trusted political agent of the army. In this capacity, he was sent to report on a large range of political groups that sprang up in Munich in this period, to see whether it was dangerous or whether it could be enrolled in the cause of counter-revolution. This was the German Workers' Party, founded on January 5th, 1919, by one Anton Drexler, a locksmith who had previously belonged to the Fatherland Party. Drexler insisted that he was a socialist and a worker, opposed to unearned capital, exploitation, and profiteering. But this was socialism with a nationalistic twist. Drexler ascribed the evils he fought to the machinations of the Jews, who had also devised the pernicious ideology of Bolshevism. He directed his appeal not to industrial workers, but to the productive estates, to all those who lived from honest labor. But when you say Bolshevism or Bolshevik, I don't know anything about Russian history. Bolshevism and Bolsheviks, that just refers to the revolutionary movement of Lenin, right? In Russia, I guess. I don't know if you would. I don't even know what the name of Russia was before the Soviet Union, or what came right after at this time. Yeah, okay. In this time period, sure. In the short run, this meant the lower middle classes, but equally in a tradition going back to Adolf Stalker's Christian social movement in the 1880s and echoing many similar nationalist initiatives in both Germany and Austria before and above all immediately after the war, Drexler's party sought in the longer term to win the working class over from Marxism and enlisted in the service of the pan-German cause. The fledgling party was in fact another creation of the hyperactive Thule Society. There was nothing unusual about Drexler or his tiny party in the far-right hothouse of Munich after the defeat of the revolution. What was unusual was the attention Hitler aroused when he went to a meeting of the party on September 12, 1919, and spoke passionately from the floor against a previous speaker who had advocated Bavaria's separation from the Reich. Okay, and then also real quick, when we say Bavaria, is this like a region with like the strongest fucking German fucking people of the best? Is this like the best German part of the German, like... We suck off Bavaria a lot. Give me a map. It's the Texas of Germany. It's southern. Okay, I see. All right. Okay, gotcha. Is Bavaria where the monarch sat as well, like in Munich and all that? Or was that like a post-World War I thing? No. 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 The emperor ruled from Berlin. Okay, gotcha. Is there a name for the area around Berlin? I feel like I've never... Brandenburg? Cringe. Okay, I hear that much. Okay. What was unusual was the attention Hitler aroused when he went to a meeting of the party on September 12, 1919, and spoke passionately from the floor against a previous speaker who had advocated Bavaria's separation from the Reich. Impressed, Drexler readily acquiesced when Hitler, again acting on the orders of his army superiors, applied to join. Although he later claimed to have been only the seventh person to join the party, he was in fact enrolled as member number 555. This was less impressive than it sounded. The German Workers' Party membership began, following a habit long established amongst fringe political groups, not with the number 1, but with the number 501, to suggest that it enjoyed a membership of hundreds rather than just a few score. Hitler, still encouraged by his superior officers in the army, rapidly became the party's star speaker. He built on his success to push the party into holding ever larger public meetings, mostly in beer halls, advertised in advance by brash poster campaigns, and often accompanied by rowdy scenes. By the end of March of 1920, now indispensable to the party, he had clearly decided that this was where his future lay. Demagogy had restored him the identity he had lost with the German defeat. He left the army and became a full-time political agitator. The appeal of radical anti-Semitism in counter-revolutionary Munich was obvious, and had already been tapped by a much larger organization with similar views, the German Racial Defense and Defiance League. This was yet another far-right group that used the swastika as its main political symbol. With its headquarters in Hamburg, the League boasted some 200,000 members all over Germany, drawn from ex-members of the Fatherland Party, from disgruntled ex-soldiers, and from nationalist-inclined students, teachers, and white-collar workers. It ran a sophisticated propaganda machine, churning out millions of leaflets and putting on mass meetings with a public numbered thousands, rather than the hundreds which Drexler's organization was able to attract. The League was far from being the only far-right movement of this kind. Another, much smaller one, the German Socialist Party, led by the engineer Alfred Brunner, also had branches in a number of German cities, though its membership was only a tenth of the size of the League's. But neither had a speaker whose polling power in any way compared to Hitler's. While conventional right-wing politicians delivered lectures or spoke in a style that was orotund and pompous, flat and dull, or rough and brutish, Hitler followed the model of social democratic orators such as Eisner or the left-wing agitators from whom he later claimed to have learned in Vienna. And he gained much of his oratorical success by telling his audiences what they wanted to hear. He used simple, straightforward language that ordinary people could understand, short sentences, powerful, emotive slogans. Often beginning a speech quietly to capture his audience's attention, he would gradually build to a climax. His deep, rather hoarse voice would rise in pitch, climbing in a crescendo to a ranting and screaming finale, accompanied by carefully rehearsed dramatic gestures, his face glistening with sweat, his lank, dark hair falling forward over his face as he worked his audience into a frenzy of emotion. There were no qualifications in what he said. Everything was absolute, uncompromising, irrevocable, undeviating, unalterable, final. He seemed, as many who listened to his early speeches testified, to speak straight from the heart and to express their own deepest fears and desires. Increasingly, too, he exuded self-confidence, aggression, belief in the ultimate triumph of his party, even a sense of destiny. His speeches often began with an account of his own poverty-stricken early life, to which he drew an implicit parallel with the downcast, downtrodden, and desperate state of Germany after the First World War. Then, his voice rising, he would describe his own political awakening and point to its counterpart in Germany's future recovery and return to glory. Without necessarily using overtly religious language, Hitler appealed to religious archetypes of suffering, humiliation, redemption, and resurrection lodged deep within his listener's psyche. And in the circumstances of post-war and post-revolutionary Bavaria, he found a ready response. Hitler's speeches reduced Germany's complex social, political, and economic problems to a simple common denominator: the evil machinations of the Jews. In My Struggle, describing how, in his view, Jewish subversives had undermined the German war effort in 1918, he declared, "If at the beginning of the war and during the war 12 or 15,000 of those Hebrew corrupters of the people had been held under poison gas, as happened to hundreds of thousands of our very best German workers in the field, the sacrifice of millions at the front would not have been in vain. On the contrary, 12,000 scoundrels eliminated in time might have saved the lives of 1,000,000 real Germans, valuable for the future. But it just happened to be in the line of bourgeois statesmanship to subject millions to a bloody end on the battlefield without batting an eyelid, but to regard 10 or 12,000 traitors, profiteers, usurers, and swindlers as a sacred national treasure and openly proclaim their inviolability." Such uncompromising radicalism lent Hitler's public meetings a revivalist fervor that was hard for less demagogic politicians to emulate. Demagogic politicians to emulate. They couldn't copy his shit. The publicity he won was enhanced by the tactic of advertising them with red posters to attract the left, with the result that protests from socialist listeners often degenerated into fisticuffs and brawls. In the climate of post-war counter-revolution, national brooding on the stab in the back, an obsession with war profiteers and merchants of the rapidly mushrooming hyperinflation, Hitler concentrated especially on rabble-rousing attacks on Jewish merchants who were supposedly pushing up the price of goods. They should all, he said, to shouts of approval from his audiences, be strung up. Perhaps to emphasize this anti-capitalist focus and to align itself with similar groups in Austria and Czechoslovakia, the party changed its name in February of 1920 to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hostile commentators soon abbreviated this to the word Nazi, just as the enemies of the Social Democrats had abbreviated the name of that party earlier on to Sazi. Or Sozi? Despite the name change, however, it would be wrong to see Nazism as a form of, or an outgrowth from, socialism. True, as some have pointed out, its rhetoric was frequently egalitarian, it stressed the need to put common needs above the needs of the individual, and it often declared itself opposed to big business and international finance capital. Famously, too, anti-Semitism was once declared to be the socialism of fools. But from the very beginning, Hitler declared himself implacably opposed to social democracy and, initially, to a much smaller extent, communism. After all, the November traitors who had signed the armistice and later the Treaty of Versailles were not communists at all, but the Social Democrats and their allies. The National Socialists wanted to unite the two political camps of left and right into which, they argued, the Jews had manipulated the German nation. The basis for this was to be the idea of race. This was light years removed from the class-based ideology of socialism. Nazism was in some ways an extreme counter-ideology to socialism, borrowing much of its rhetoric in the process from its self-image as a movement rather than a party to its much-vaunted contempt for bourgeois convention and conservative timidity. The idea of a party suggested allegiance to parliamentary democracy, working steadily within a settled democratic polity. In speeches and propaganda, however, Hitler and his followers referred on the whole to talk of the National Socialist movement, just as the Social Democrats had talked of the workers' movement, or, come to that, the feminists of the women's movement, and the apostles of pre-war teenage rebellion of the youth movement. The term not only suggested dynamism and unceasing forward motion, it also more than hinted at an ultimate goal, an absolute object to work towards that was grander and more final than the endless compromises of conventional politics. By presenting itself as a movement, National Socialism, like the labor movement, advertised its opposition to conventional politics and its intention to subvert and ultimately overthrow the system within which it was initially forced to work. By replacing class with race, the dictatorship of the proletariat with the dictatorship of the leader, Nazism reversed the usual terms of socialist ideology. The synthesis of right and left was neatly symbolized in the party's official flag, personally chosen by Hitler in mid-1920s. The field was bright red, the color of socialism, with the swastika, the emblem of racist nationalism, outlined in black in the middle of a white circle at the center of the flag, so that the whole ensemble made a combination of black, white, and red, the colors of the official flag of the Bismarckian Empire. In the wake of the 1918 revolution, these came to symbolize rejection of the Weimar Republic and all it stood for, but by changing the design and adding the swastika, a symbol already used by a variety of far-right racist movements and Free Corps units in the post-war period, the Nazis also announced that what they wanted to replace it with was a new pan-German racial state, not the old Wilhelmine status quo. By the end of 1920, Hitler's early emphasis on attacking Jewish capitalism had been modified to bring in Marxism, or in other words, social democracy, and Bolshevism as well. The cruelties of the Civil War and Red Terror in Lenin's Russia were making an impact, and Hitler could use them to lend emphasis to common far-right views of the supposedly Jewish inspiration behind the revolutionary upheavals of 1918 to 1919 in Munich. Nazism would also have been possible, however, without the communist threat. Hitler's anti-Bolshevism was the product of his anti-Semitism and not the other way around. His principal political targets remained the Social Democrats and the vaguer specter of Jewish capitalism. Borrowing the stock arguments of anti-Semitism from before the war, Hitler declared in numerous speeches that the Jews were a race of parasites who could only live by subverting other peoples, above all, the highest and best of all races, the Aryans. Thus, they divided the Aryan race against itself, both organizing capitalist exploitation on the one hand and leading the struggle against it on the other. The Jews, he said in a speech delivered on April 6, 1920, were to be exterminated. On August 7th, the same year, he told his audience that they should not believe that you can fight a disease without killing the cause, without annihilating the bacillus, and do not think that you can fight racial tuberculosis without taking care that the people are free of the cause of racial tuberculosis. Annihilation meant the violent removal of the Jews from Germany by any means. The solution of the Jewish question, he told his listener in April of 1921, could only be solved by brute force. We know, he said in January of 1923, that if they come to power, our heads will roll in the sand. But we also know that when we get our hands on power, then God have mercy on you. Wow, what a baller. This guy has a bright political future ahead of him. At the end of the First World War, General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's military dictator for the last 2 years or so of the conflict, thought it prudent to remove himself from the political scene for a while. Dismissed from office on October 25, 1918, after a bitter row with the newly appointed last liberal government of the Kaiser, he lingered on for a while in Berlin. Then, donning dark glasses and false whiskers, he slipped across the Baltic to Sweden to sit out the revolution. By February of 1919, he evidently thought the worst was over and returned to Germany. Such was the prestige he had gained in the war that he quickly became the figurehead of the radical right. A pan-German annexationist in 1914 to 1918 and a rabid opponent of the peace settlement, he immediately began conspiring to overthrow the new Republican order. Gathering a group of his former aides around him, he lent his support to the short-lived Putsch, that's what I'm calling it, mounted against the government in Berlin by Wolfgang Kapp and the Free Corps in March of 1920, and when this failed, left for the more congenial atmosphere of Munich. Here, he soon came into contact with the ultranationalist circle that had by now gathered around the previously unknown figure of Adolf Hitler. By the time the two eventually met, Hitler had acquired the first members of the devoted band of enthusiasts who would play a key role in one capacity or another in the growth of the Nazi Party and the building of the Third Reich. Most devoted of all was the student Rudolf Hess, a pupil of the geopolitical theorist Karl Haushofer at Munich University. The son of an authoritarian businessman who had refused to allow him to study before the war, Hess seemed to be looking for a strong leader to whom he could bind himself unconditionally. Like a number of subsequently prominent Nazis, he came from outside the German Reich. Hess was born in Alexandria in 1894. Service in the war, which he ended as an Air Force lieutenant, gave him one kind of authority to obey, study with Haushofer another. Wait, hold on. No idea where Alexandria is. Egypt. Really? Oh, and that is, I was going to say a coastal thing, but I guess that's basically where everything in Egypt is. Gotcha. Service in the war, which he ended as an Air Force lieutenant, gave him one kind of authority to obey, study with Haushofer another. Neither gave him what he really wanted, any more than did the Free Corps or the Thule Society, of which Hess was also a member. It was eventually provided by Hitler, whom he met in 1920. Anti-Semitism was a shared passion. Hess denounced the pack of Jews who he thought had betrayed Germany in 1918, and even before he met Hitler, he led expeditions to working-class districts of Munich to slip thousands of anti-Semitic leaflets under the front doors of workers' flats. Henceforth, Hess directed all the force of his hero worship towards Hitler. Naive, idealistic, without personal ambition or greed, and, according to Haushofer, not very bright, Hess had an inclination to believe in irrational and mystical doctrines such as astrology. His dog-like devotion to Hitler was almost religious in its fervor. He regarded Hitler as a kind of messiah. From now on, he would be Hitler's silent, passive slave, drinking in his master's words at the regular coffee round in the Café Heck, and gradually taking much of the burden of the routine work Hitler so hated off his shoulders. In addition, he introduced Hitler to an elaborate version of the common pan-German theory of living space, or Lebensraum, with which Haushofer justified German claims to conquer Eastern Europe, which the novelist Hans Grimm popularized with his bestseller Race Without Space, or Volk ohne Raum, in 1926. Useful to Hitler in another way was the failed racist poet and dramatist Dietrich Eckart, a former medical student. Eckart was already active in far-right circles in December of 1918 when he started publishing a political weekly in plain German, Auf gut Deutsch, with backing from a number of Bavarian businessmen and also the political fund of the army. Eckart blamed his failure to get his plays performed on what he believed to be the Jewish domination of culture. He was in personal contact with other racists and Aryan supremacists like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose work he did much to popularize. Like many anti-Semites, he defined as Jewish anyone who was subversive or materialistic, including, among others, in his view, Lenin and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Well-connected and well-off, Eckart, like Hess, was a member of the Thule Society and raised the funds from his friends and from the army for the Nazi Party to buy the society's ailing newspaper, The Racial Observer. Völkischer Beobachter. Okay. In December of 1920. He became editor himself, bringing much-needed journalistic experience to its twice-weekly editions and expanding it into a daily early in 1923. Eventually, however, his relative independence and his rather patronizing attitude towards Hitler led to a cooling of relations between the two men, and he was dismissed as editor of the paper in March of 1923, dying later in the year. Two associates he brought into the party from the Thule Society served Hitler more reliably, however, and a good deal longer. The first of these was the Baltic German architect Alfred Rosenberg, another leading Nazi from beyond the Reich. He was born in Revel, Estonia in 1893. He fled the Russian Revolution, conceiving an intense hatred for Bolshevism, and at the end of the war arrived in Munich, where he became a contributor to Eckert's little magazine. He had already become an anti-Semite before 1914, as a result of reading Houston Stewart Chamberlain's work at the age of 16. An enthusiast for the Tsarist police forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which purported to provide evidence of an international Jewish plot to subvert civilization, Rosenberg also read Gobineau and Nietzsche, and after the war wrote polemical tracts attacking Jews and Freemasons. Wait, did the Protocols of the Elders of Zion really come from the Tsarists? I didn't know that if that's true, unless that's referring to a different thing, but I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm weak on my neo-Nazism. Okay. The Tsarists were the people that were before the ones that the Bolsheviks overthrew, right? The Tsar was the Russian Empire prior to Lenin? Okay. His main desire was to be taken seriously as an intellectual and a philosophy debate bro and a cultural theorist. In 1930, Rosenberg was to publish his magnum opus named The Myth of the 20th Century in homage to the principal work of his idol, Houston Stewart Chamberlain. This was intended to provide the Nazi Party with a major work of theory. The book had sold over 1 million copies by 1945, and some of its ideas were not without influence. But Hitler himself claimed never to have read more than a small part of it and disliked what he saw as a pseudo-religious tone, and it is unlikely that more than a few of the most dedicated readers managed to plow their way through its acres of turgid prose to the end. Still, in their frequent conversations in Munich cafes, Rosenberg, more than anyone, probably turned Hitler's attention towards the threat of communism and its supposed creation by a Jewish conspiracy, and alerted Hitler to what he considered the fragile nature of the Soviet-Russian polity. Through Rosenberg, Russian anti-Semitism, with its extreme conspiracy theories and its exterminatory thrust, found its way into Nazi ideology in the early 1920s. Jewish Bolshevism now became a major target of Hitler's hate. The other man whom Eckert brought into the Nazi Party was Hans Frank. He was born in Karlsruhe in 1900, the son of a lawyer who initially followed in his father's footsteps. While still a law student in 1919, he joined the Thule Society and served in the Epp Free Corps in the storming of Munich. Frank quickly fell under Hitler's spell, though he never became one of his inner circle. Hearing him speak in January of 1920, Frank felt, like many others, that Hitler's words came directly from the heart. He uttered what was in the consciousness of all those present, he later said. Throughout his life, he was fascinated by the pornography of violence. He admired brutal men of action and frequently used the language of violence with a directness and aggression unmatched by almost any other leading Nazi in an attempt to seem like them. But his legal training and background gave him residual belief in the law that sometimes sat uneasily alongside his penchant for coarse language and his defense of murderous actions. He qualified as a lawyer with a doctorate in 1924, and his legal expertise, however limited, was to prove extremely useful to the party. Up to 1933, he represented it in over 2,400 cases brought against its members, usually for acts of violence of one kind or another. Soon after he defended some Nazi thugs in court for the first time, a senior lawyer who had been one of his teachers said, "I beg you to leave these people alone. No good will come of it. Political movements that begin in the criminal courts will end in the criminal courts." Rip. By the time these men and many more like them had become part of the Nazi Party, the fledgling movement had an official program composed by Hitler and Drexler with a little help from the racial economist Gottfried Feder, and approved on February 24, 1920. Its 25 points included the demand for the union of all Germans in a greater Germany, the revocation of the 1919 peace treaties, land and territories, colonies, to feed our people, the prevention of non-German immigration, and the death penalty for common criminals, usurers, profiteers, etc. Jews were to be Feder, Fader. Jews were to be denied civil rights and registered as aliens, and they were to be banned from owning or writing for German newspapers. A pseudo-socialist note was sounded by the demand for the abolition of unearned incomes and confiscation of war profits, the nationalization of business trusts, and the introduction of profit sharing. The program concluded with a demand for the creation of a strong central state power for the Reich and the effective replacement of the federated state parliaments by corporations based on estate and occupation. It was a typical far-right document of its time. In practice, it did not mean very much, and, like the Social Democrats' Erfurt program of 1891, was often bypassed or ignored in the everyday political struggle, although it was soon declared to be unalterable so as to prevent it from becoming a focus for internal dissension. Dissension there was, however, with other causes, principally Drexler's efforts to merge the party with other far-right organizations in the Bavarian capital. Drexler had his eye, in particular, on the German Socialist Party, a similar-sized group with virtually identical aims to those of the Nazis. Unlike the Nazi Party, it had a presence in North Germany. A merger would give more influence to those who, like Fader, disapproved of the vulgarity of Hitler's constant rabble-rousing speeches. Hitler, fearing he would be submerged in the new movement, scotched the negotiations in April of 1921 by threatening to resign. Another crisis blew up when Hitler was with Eckert in Berlin on a fundraising mission for the Racial Observer. Merger talks began again in his absence, this time also involving a third small anti-Semitic party based in Augsburg and led by one Otto Dickel, whose abilities as a public speaker were rated by some almost as highly as Hitler's own. Unable to prevent the Nazi Party going along with Dickel's scheme to create a merged Western League, named after his somewhat mystical racist tract, The Resurrection of the West, Hitler threw a tantrum and resigned from the party altogether. This brought matters to a head as Drexler backpedaled and asked Hitler to name the conditions on which he would rejoin. In the end, few were prepared to do without the man whose demagogy had been the sole reason for the party's growth over the previous months. The merger plans were abandoned. Hitler's uncompromising conditions were accepted with acclaim at an extraordinary general meeting on the 29th of July. They culminated in the demand that he should be made party chairman with dictatorial powers and that the party be purged of the foreign elements which have now penetrated it. Having secured his complete mastery over the Nazi Party, Hitler now enjoyed its full support for the propaganda campaign he quickly unfolded. It soon descended from provocation to violence. On September 14, 1921, a group of young Nazis went with Hitler to a meeting of the Bavarian League, a separatist organization, and marched onto the platform with the intention of silencing the speaker, Otto Ballerstedt. Someone switched all the lights off, and when they came on again, chants of Hitler prevented Ballerstedt from continuing. As the audience protested, Hitler's young thugs attacked the separatist leader, beat him up, and pushed him roughly off the platform onto the floor, where he lay bleeding profusely from a head wound. Soon the police appeared and closed the meeting down. Ballerstedt insisted on prosecuting Hitler, who duly served a month in Munich's Stadelheim jail. The police warned him that if he continued in this way, he would be sent back to Austria as an alien. The warning had little effect. In early November 1921, shortly after his release, Hitler was at the center of another beer cellar brawl, with beer mugs flying across the room as Nazis and Social Democrats traded blows. Soon, the Nazis were arming themselves with knuckle dusters, rubber truncheons, pistols, and even grenades. In the summer of 1922, a crowd of Nazis shouted, whistled, and spat at Reich President Ebert as he was visiting Munich. An outing to a nationalist rally in Coburg in October 1922 culminated in a pitched battle with Social Democrats in which the Nazis eventually drove their opponents from the streets with their rubber truncheons. What the fuck is a truncheon? Is that like a rubber? It's a shovel, right? Club? Is it a club? A truncheon? Okay. Not surprisingly, the Nazi Party was soon banned in most German states. Okay. Especially after the murder of Foreign Minister Rathenow in June of 1922, when the Berlin government attempted a clampdown on far-right extremists, whether or not they had been involved in the assassination, but not in right-wing Bavaria. The new note of physical violence in the Nazi campaign reflected, not least, the rapid growth of the party's paramilitary wing, Founded early in 1920 as a hall protection group, soon renamed the Gymnastics and Sports Section. With their brown shirts and breeches, jack boots and caps, a uniform that only found its final form in 1924, its members soon became a familiar sight on Munich's streets, beating up their opponents on the streets and attacking anyone they thought looked like a Jew. What turned them from a small group of bully boys into a major paramilitary movement was a series of events that had little to do with Hitler. The relative immunity from police interference, which they enjoyed, reflected in the first place the fact that the Bavarian government, led by Gustav Ritter von Kahr, had long been sympathetic to paramilitary movements of the far right as part of the counter-revolutionary White Terror of 1919 to 1920. In this atmosphere, Captain Hermann Ehrhardt, former commander of the Free Corps Brigade, had established an elaborate network of assassination squads that had carried out political murders all over Germany, including the killings of several leading Republican politicians and the murder of a number of their own members whom they suspected as double agents. Kahr himself regarded the Republic as a Prussian creation to be countered by the maintenance of Bavaria as a center of anti-Republican order, and to this end he maintained a massive so-called Denizens Defense Force set up immediately after the crushing of the Communist Council Republic in the spring of 1919. Heavily armed and militarily equipped, it clearly contravened the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and was compulsorily wound up early in 1921. Its dissolution was the signal for a reorganization of Bavaria's radical right and a sharp increase in the incidence of violence as its members were formed into a huge variety of armed bands, many of them Bavarian separatist in orientation, all of them anti-Semitic. Ehrhardt brought his Free Corps veterans into the Nazis' Gymnastics and Sports Section in August of 1921. They were hardened graduates of violent confrontations with Poles and others in Silesia, where the peace settlement had created massive German resentment by lopping off territory held by Germany before the war to give to the newly founded Polish state. The deal with Ehrhardt was brokered with Ernst Röhm, another Free Corps veteran, who had participated in the assault on Munich in the early spring of 1919. Silesia? Born in 1887, the son of a Bavarian railway official, Röhm had joined the army in 1906 and became an officer 2 years later. He served at the front of the war, but was invalidated out. Shrapnel had partially destroyed his nose and badly damaged his face, and he had been previously wounded in Verdun. After this, Röhm worked at the War Ministry in Bavaria and was in charge of arranging the supply of weapons, first for Kahr's Denizens Defense Force, and then for its fragmented successor groups. Known to such people as the Machine Gun King, Röhm boasted a huge range of contacts on the far right. Among other things, he was a staff officer and enjoyed a high reputation in the army and acted as a liaison officer with the paramilitaries. He clearly had a talent for organization, but his interest did not really lie in politics. Ernst Röhm was the epitome of a frontline generation that had come to believe in its own myth. Röhm's penchant was for mindless violence, not political conspiracy. An analysis of his writings has shown that he used words like prudent, compromise, intellectual, bourgeois, or middle class almost invariably in a pejorative sense. His positive, admiring expressions included strapping, daredevil, ruthless, and faithful. The first words of his autobiography, published in Munich in 1928, were, "I am a soldier." He described himself as contrary and complained, "The Germans have forgotten how to hate. Feminine complaining has taken the place of masculine hatred. Since I am an immature and wicked person," he wrote with characteristic openness, "war and unrest appeal to me more than the well-behaved bourgeois order." He had no interest at all in ideas and glorified the rough and brutal lifestyle of the soldier in his acts as well as his creed. He had nothing but contempt for civilians and reveled in the lawlessness of wartime life. Drinking and carousing, fighting and brawling cemented the band of brothers among whom he found his place. Women were treated with disdain. Strangers to the military life had no place in his world. Röhm saw in Hitler, whose own penchant for using physical violence to further his ends was already more than obvious, a natural vehicle for his desires, and took the lead in building up the party's paramilitary wing movement, renamed the Storm Division, in October of 1921. His connections in the army hierarchy and the upper levels of Bavarian politics and with the paramilitaries were invaluable to the fledgling organization. At the same time, however, he always maintained a degree of independence from Hitler, never really fell under his personal spell, and sought to use his movement as a vehicle for his own cult of ceaseless violent activism rather than placing the stormtroopers unconditionally at the party's disposal. The SA remained a formally separate organization, therefore, and Rome's relations with the Nazi Party's leaders always retained an uneasy undertone. With Rome in the lead, the stormtroopers soon began to grow in numbers. Yet, by August 1922, they still counted no more than 800 in their ranks, and other, long since forgotten paramilitary movements, such as the Reich War Flag or the Bavaria and Reich League, which had no fewer than 30,000 members, all of them armed, were far more prominent. It needed much more than the influence of Erhard and Rome and the demagoguery of Hitler before the Nazis and their paramilitary movement could seize the initiative in Bavarian politics. In 1922, the Nazis' hopes were sharply raised when news came in of Benito Mussolini's march on Rome on October 28th, which had immediately led to the fascist leader's appointment as Prime Minister of Italy. Where the Italians had succeeded, surely their German counterparts could not be far behind. As so often with Mussolini, the image was more than the reality. Born in 1883, and in his early life a prominent socialist journalist, Mussolini had changed his politics dramatically during his campaign for Italy's entry into the war. And at the war's end, he became the spokesman for Italian feelings of injured pride as the peace settlement failed to deliver the hoped-for gains. In 1919, he launched his fascist movement, which used violent tactics, terror, and intimidation against its left-wing opponents, who were alarming industrialists, employers, and businessmen with policies such as occupying factories in pursuit of their demand for common ownership of the means of production. Rural unrest also drove landowners into the arms of the fascist squads, and, as the situation deteriorated in the course of 1920 and 1921, Mussolini was carried along by the dynamism of his movement. His rise to prominence indicated that post-war conflict, civil strife, murder, and war were not confined to Germany. They were widespread across Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe. They included the Russo-Polish War, which only ended in 1921, armed iridescent conflicts in many of the successor states to the Habsburg Empire, and the creation of short-lived dictatorships in Spain and Greece. Mussolini's example influenced the Nazi Party in a number of ways, notably in its adoption in late 1922 and early 1923 of the title of leader, or Duce, I think. In Italian, Führer in German, to denote the unquestionable authority of the man at the movement's head. Oh, Duce. The growing cult of Hitler's personality in the Nazi Party, fueled by the Italian precedent, also helped convince Hitler himself that it was he, and not some figure yet to come, who was destined to lead Germany into a future national rebirth, a conviction that was indelibly confirmed by the events of the autumn of 1923. By this time, the Nazis had also begun to borrow from the Italian fascists the rigid, outstretched right arm salute with which they ritually greeted their leader in an imitation of the ceremonies of imperial Rome. The leader responded by raising his own right hand, forming a heart symbol around his own heart, and telling the audience that he loved them, but he had to have extreme autism in order to do it. The leader responded by raising his own right hand, but crooked back at the elbow, palm opened upwards in a gesture of acceptance. The Nazi Party's use of elaborate standards to carry its flag also derived from the practice of the Italian fascists. Mussolini's main practical influence on Hitler at this period, however, was to convince him that the tactic of a march on the capital was the quickest way to power. As the fascist squads began to seize control of major cities and towns in the Italian north, Mussolini, drawing on the famous example of the revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi during the unification of Italy more than 60 years before, declared that he would use them as a base for a march on Rome. In order to avoid bloodshed, the Italian king and the leading politicians capitulated and appointed him prime minister, a position which he used with increasing ruthlessness to establish a dictatorial, one-party state by the end of the decade. Mussolini's fascist movement shared many key characteristics not only with Nazism, but also with other extremist movements of the right. For example, in Hungary, where Gyula Gombos, was referring to himself as a National Socialist as early as 1919. Italian fascism was violent, ceaselessly active. It despised parliamentary institutions. It was militaristic, and it glorified conflict and war. It was bitterly opposed not only to communism, but also, even more importantly, to socialism and to liberalism. It favored an organic view of society in which class interests and popular representation would be replaced by appointed institutions, cutting across the classes and uniting the nation. It was masculinist and anti-feminist, seeking a state in which men would rule and women would be reduced mainly to the functions of childbearing and child-rearing based. It elevated the leader to a position of unchallenged authority. It espoused a cult of youth, declaring its intention of sweeping away old institutions and traditions and creating a new form of human being, tough, anti-intellectual, modern, secular, and above all, fanatically devoted to the cause of his own nation and race. So based. Oh my God. This is the incel paradise. In all the, does that mean they get state-mandated wives too? In all these respects, it provided a model and a parallel for the emerging Nazi Party. Early Nazism, therefore, like the myriad competing movements of the far right in the immediate post-year wars, belonged firmly in the wider context of the rise of European fascism. For a long time, Hitler looked admiringly to Mussolini as an example to follow. The March on Rome galvanized the nascent fascist movements of Europe, much as Garibaldi's March on Rome and the subsequent unification of Italy had galvanized the nationalist movements of Europe 60 or so years earlier. The tide of history seemed to be moving in Hitler's direction. Democracy's days were numbered. As the situation in Germany began to deteriorate with increasing rapidity in the course of 1922 and 1923, Hitler began to think of what he could do. Hitler began to think that he could do the same in Germany as Mussolini had done in Italy. When the German government defaulted on reparations payments, and French troops occupied the Ruhr, nationalists in Germany exploded with rage and humiliation. The Republic's loss of legitimacy was incalculable. The government had to be seen to be doing something to oppose the occupation. A widespread campaign of civil disobedience, encouraged by the German government, led to further reprisals on the part of the French, with arrests, imprisonments, and expulsions. Among many examples of French repression, nationalists remembered how one war veteran and railway worker was sacked and deported with his family for delivering a pro-German speech at a war memorial. Another man, a schoolteacher, suffered the same fate after getting his pupils to turn their backs when French troops marched past. Schoolboy gangs shaved the heads of women thought to be shamelessly consorting with the French, while others, less dramatically, demonstrated their patriotism by walking miles to school rather than traveling by the French-run railway. A few workers actively tried to sabotage the occupation. One of them, Albert Leo Schlechter, a former Free Corps soldier, was executed for his activities, and the nationalist right, led by the Nazis, quickly seized on the incident as an example of the brutality of the French and the weakness of the Berlin government, turning Schlechter into a much-publicized nationalist martyr in the process. Industry ground to a standstill, further exacerbating the country's already dire financial problems. Nationalists had a potent propaganda weapon in the presence of black French colonial troops amongst the occupying forces. Racism was endemic in all European societies in the interwar years, as it was indeed in the United States and other parts of the world too. It was generally assumed by Europeans that dark-skinned people were inferior human beings, savages whom it was the white man's mission to tame. The use of colonial troops by the British and French during the First World War had excited a certain amount of unfavorable comment in Germany, but it was their presence on German territory itself, first of all in the occupied part of the Rhineland, then in 1923 during the brief French march into the Ruhr, that really opened the floodgates for lurid racist propaganda. Many Germans living in the Rhineland and the Saar felt humiliated that, as one of them later put it, Siamese, Senegalese, and Arabs made themselves the masters of our homeland. Soon, cartoonists were arousing racist and nationalist emotions by penning crude, semi-pornographic sketches of bestial black soldiers carrying off innocent white German women to a fate worse than death. On the right, this became a potent symbol of Germany's national humiliation during the Weimar years, and the myth of the mass rape of German women by French colonial troops became so powerful that the few hundred mixed-race children to be found in Germany in the early 1930s were almost universally regarded as the offspring of such incidents. In fact, the overwhelming majority of them actually seem to have been the result of consensual unions, often between German colonists and indigenous Africans in the German colonies before or during the war. As the Nazis and many more who thought like them exploited these fears and resentments to the full, the government in Berlin seemed powerless to do anything about it. Plans and conspiracies began to multiply. Hitler was not the only person to contemplate a march on Berlin. The National Bolshevist Hans von Hentig, who has become Germany's most distinguished criminologist after 1945, was also starting to gather arms and troops in a harebrained scheme to use the Communist Party as an ally in a violent seizure of power with the aims of getting Germany to repudiate the Treaty of Versailles. The idea was not very realistic. Whoever tried to put it into action, both Germany's federal structure and its constitution made a repetition of what had happened in Italy extremely unlikely. Nevertheless, it quickly took root. Hitler embarked on a massive propaganda offensive, berating the November criminals in Berlin for their weakness and building up in a crescendo of public demonstrations against the French. His prospects were greatly improved at this time by the accession of a further group of new and very useful supporters to the Nazi movement. Among them was Ernst PUTSCH NFST Hanfstengel, a tall, part American socialite from a wealthy background in the world of art dealing and publishing, whose snobbery always prevented him from falling wholly under Hitler's spell. But Hanfstengel thought Hitler's petty bourgeois simplicity, his appalling taste in art, his ignorance of wine, his clumsy table manners, simply underlined his patent sincerity. His lack of polish was an essential precondition of his uncanny ability to connect with the masses. Like many other admirers of Hitler, Hanfstengel first came into contact with him by attending one of his speeches. For his part, Hitler was overwhelmed by Hanfstengel's drawing room sophistication and enjoyed listening to him playing Wagner on the piano, marching round the room and conducting with his arms as the strains of the master sounded out. More seriously, Hanfstengel was able to introduce Hitler to influential people in Munich high society, including publishers, businessmen, and army officers. Such circles found it amusing to patronize him, were entertained when he appeared at their elegant parties dressed in an army coat and carrying a dog whip, and shared enough of his views to guarantee his loans, as the wife of the piano manufacturer Bechstein did, and to support him in various other ways. Only the most dedicated, however, like the businessman Kurt Ludeck, gave Hitler money in any great quantity. Otherwise, the Nazi Party had to rely on its friends in high places, like the former diplomat Max Erwin von Schubner-Richter, to steer a small portion of business funds meant for Ludendorff in their direction, while it continued to draw most of its income from party membership dues. A very different kind of backing was provided in October 1922 by the arrival in the Nazi Party with his followers in Nuremberg of Julius Streicher, another ex-soldier, sporting, like Hitler, the Iron Cross, and a founder member of the German Socialist Party after the war. Impressed by Hitler's progress, Streicher brought so many supporters into the Nazi Party that it virtually doubled in size overnight. Protestant Franconia was an ideal recruiting ground for Nazism, with its resentful peasantry, its susceptibility to the appeal of anti-Semitism, and the absence of any dominant established political party. Streicher's accession extended the party's influence significantly further northwards. But in acquiring Streicher, the party also acquired a vicious anti-Semite whose extreme hatred of the Jews matched even Hitler's, and a man of violence who carried a heavy whip in public and personally beat up his helpless opponents once he had achieved a position of power. In 1923, Streicher founded a sensational popular newspaper, the Der Stürmer, which rapidly established itself as the place where screaming headlines introduced the most rabid attacks on Jews, full of sexual innuendo, racist caricatures, made-up accusations of ritual murder, and titillating semi-pornographic stories of Jewish men seducing innocent German girls. So extreme was the paper, and so obviously obsessive was its brutish-looking, shaven-headed editor, that Streicher never acquired a great deal of influence within the movement, whose leader regarded him with some distaste, and the paper was even banned for a period under the Third Reich. Damn, okay. Wait, hold on. All right. Yet, Streicher was not just a thug. A former school teacher, he was also a poet whose lyrics have been described as quite attractive, and, like Hitler, he painted watercolors, though in his case only as a hobby. Streicher, too, fancied himself as an artist. He was not without education. He was a professional journalist and was also, therefore, in a sense, a bohemian like Hitler. His ideas, though expressed in an extreme form, were not particularly unusual in the right-wing circles of the day, and owed a lot, as he himself acknowledged, to the influence of pre-war German anti-Semitism, particularly Theodor Fritsch. And Streicher's anti-Semitism was in no sense on the outer fringe of the Nazi movement. Hitler, indeed, later commented that Streicher, in a way, idealized the Jew. The Jew is baser, fiercer, and more diabolical than Streicher depicted him. He may not have been an effective administrator, Hitler conceded, and his sexual appetite led him into all kinds of trouble, but Hitler always remained loyal to him. Oh, you know what that means. At times, when it was important for Nazism to present a respectable face, the stormer could be an embarrassment, but only as a matter of tactics, never as an issue of principle or belief. In 1923, Hitler and the Nazi Party felt no particular need to look respectable. Violence seemed the obvious way to power. The far-right Bavarian government of Gustav Ritter von Kahr, sympathetic to the paramilitaries, had fallen in September of 1921. Since then, Kahr and his friends had been embroiled in intrigues against the government, led by Eugen von Nilling and his Bavarian People's Party. As many moderate conservatives were to do later on, Nilling, right, and his allies felt that the Nazis were a threat and disliked their violence, but considered that their heart was in the right place and their idealism only needed to be used in a more productive and healthy way. So they, too, were relatively tolerant of the Nazis' activities. Moreover, on the one occasion on which they tried to crack down by banning a Nazi Party rally at the end of January of 1923, fearing it would become violent, the army commander in Bavaria, General Hermann von Lossow, was contacted by Rome and agreed to support Hitler's right to hold the rally, providing he gave a guarantee that it would be peaceful. Kahr, at this time, regional government of Upper Bavaria, supported him, and the Bavarian government backed down. Events now moved rapidly towards a climax. Much of the time, they were beyond Hitler's control. In particular, Ernst Röhm, quite independently from him, succeeded in getting the main paramilitary organizations in Bavaria together in a working community of patriotic fighting leagues, which included some much larger groups than the Nazi brown shirts. These groups surrendered their weapons to the regular army, whose Bavarian units, under General von Lossow, were clearly readying themselves for the much-bruited march on Berlin and an armed confrontation with the French in the Ruhr, and they enrolled the paramilitaries as auxiliaries and started to train them. Into this witch's brew of paramilitary conspiracy, there now came General Ludendorff. An attempt by Hitler to seize the initiative by demanding the return of the brown shirts' weapons from the army met with a cool rebuff. He was forced to yield to Ludendorff as the figurehead of the conspiracy when the paramilitaries staged a huge parade in Nuremberg at the beginning of September with as many as 100,000 uniformed men taking part. Hitler was named political leader of the paramilitaries, but, far from being in control of the situation, he was being swept along by events. Röhm's role in the reorganized paramilitary movement was crucial, and he now resigned as head of the small Nazi stormtrooper organization in order to concentrate on it. He was succeeded by a man who was to play a key role in the subsequent development of the Nazi movement and the Third Reich, Hermann Göring. Born in 1893 in Rosenheim, Bavaria, Göring was another man of action, but of a very different stamp for Röhm. He came from an upper-middle-class Bavarian background. His father had played a key role in the German colonization of Namibia before the war and was a convinced German imperialist. From 1905 to 1911, Göring attended military college, latterly in Berlin, and even afterwards regarded himself as a Prussian soldier rather than a Bavarian. During the war, he became a well-known flying ace, ending it in commands of the fighter squadron founded by the Red Baron von Richthofen. His exploits as a pilot had earned him Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite, and a popular reputation as a swashbuckling daredevil. Fighter pilots were widely regarded as kind of modern knight in armor, whose daring do contrasted dramatically with the dull, mechanized slaughter of the trenches, and Goering was lionized in aristocratic circles, strengthening his upper-crust social contacts by marrying in February 1922 a Swedish baroness, Karin von Kantzau. Like many other wartime fighters, he continued to search for a life of action after the conflict was over, briefly belonging to a free corps, then becoming a show flyer in Scandinavia, and finally, through the influence of his wife, finding his way into Hitler's movement toward the end of 1922. At this time, therefore, Goering was a dashing, handsome, romantic figure whose exploits were celebrated in numerous adultery popular books and magazine articles. Goering's longing for action found its fulfillment in the Nazi movement. Ruthless, energetic, and extremely egotistical, Goering nevertheless fell completely under Hitler's spell from the very start. Loyalty and faithfulness were for him the highest virtues. Like Rome, Goering too regarded politics as warfare, a form of armed combat in which neither justice nor morality had a part to play. The strong won, the weak perished, the law was a mass of legalistic rules that were there to be broken if the need arose. For Goering, the end always justified the means, and the end was always what he conceived of as the national interest of Germany, which he considered had been betrayed by Jews, Democrats, and revolutionaries in 1918. Goering's aristocratic connections, his chiseled good looks, his cosmopolitan mastery of French, Italian, and Swedish, and his reputation as a chivalrous fighter pilot persuaded many that he was a moderate, a diplomatist, even. Hindenburg and many like him thought of Goering as the acceptable face of Nazism, an authoritarian conservative like themselves. The appearance was deceptive. He was as ruthless, as violent, and as extreme as any of the leading Nazis. These varying qualities, allied to the rapidly growing abnegation of his will before Hitler's, made him the ideal choice as the new leader of the stormtroopers in place of Rome early in 1923. With Goering in charge, the stormtroopers could now be expected to toe the Nazi line again. Preparations went ahead, in conjunction with the wider paramilitary movement, which Rome steered as far as he was able, for a rising throughout the spring and early summer of 1923. The crisis finally came when the Reich government in Berlin was forced to resign on August 13th. Its successor, a broad coalition that included the Social Democrats, was led by Gustav Stresemann, a right-wing liberal nationalist who over the coming years was to prove himself the Republic's most skilled, most subtle, and most realistic politician. Stresemann realized that the campaign of passive resistance to the French occupation of the Ruhr had to be ended, and the galloping hyperinflation brought under control. He instituted a policy of fulfillment in which Germany would fulfill the terms of the peace settlement, including the payment of reparations, while lobbying behind the scenes for them to be changed. His policy met with notable success during the next 6 years, during which he held the position of Reich Foreign Minister. But to the extreme nationalists, it was nothing more than national betrayal. Realizing that they were now likely to stage an uprising, the Bavarian government appointed Kahr as a general state commissioner with full powers to maintain order. Backed by Lessau and the police chief, Hans Ritter von Seisser, Kahr banned a series of meetings planned by the Nazis for September 27th, while they pursued their own plans for the overthrow of the government in Berlin. Pressure mounted on all sides for action. Amongst the rank and file of the paramilitaries, as Hitler was repeatedly warned, it was becoming almost irresistible. In Berlin, the army leader, General Hans von Seeckt, refused to go along with the plans of Lessau, Seisser, and Kahr. He preferred to remove Stresemann's government by backstairs intrigue, which indeed he eventually did, though it was succeeded by another coalition in which Stresemann remained foreign minister. Feverish negotiations in Munich failed to produce any unity between the Bavarian army under Lessau, the police under Seisser, and the paramilitaries, whose political representative was, of course, Hitler. Aware that he would lose the support of the paramilitaries if he dithered any longer, and worried that Kahr was himself considering action, Hitler, now backed by Ludendorff, decided on a putsch. The Bavarian government would be arrested, and Kahr and his allies would be forced to join with the paramilitaries in a march on Berlin. The date for the putsch was set more under the pressure of events than by any search for a symbolic date for November 9th, the anniversary of the outbreak of the Revolution of 1918 that had overthrown the Kaiser's regime. On the evening of November 8th, Hitler and a body of heavily armed stormtroopers broke into a meeting addressed by car in the Burgerbruckeller, a beer cellar just outside the center of Munich. Hitler ordered one of his men to fire a pistol shot into the ceiling to silence the crowd, then announced that the hall was surrounded. The Bavarian government, he declared, was deposed. While Goering calmed the audience, Hitler took Kahr, Lissau, and Seisser into an adjoining room and explained that he would march on Berlin, installing himself at the head of a new Reich government. Ludendorff would take over the National Army. They would be rewarded for their support with important positions themselves. Returning to speak to the crowd, Hitler won them over with a dramatic plea for backing in what he called his action against the November criminals of 1918. Kahr and his companions had no option but to return to the podium and, joined now by Ludendorff, declared their support. But translating historic demonstrations into political power was not so easy. The Nazis' plans for a putsch, were half-baked. Rome occupied the army headquarters in Munich, and Nazi units also took over the police headquarters, but other buildings including, crucially, the army barracks, remained in government hands. And while Hitler went into the city to try and sort things out, Ludendorff released Kahr and the other prisoners, who promptly backtracked on their enforced compliance with the plot and immediately got in touch with the army, the police, and the media to repudiate Hitler's actions. Back in the beer cellar, Hitler and Ludendorff decided to march on the city center. They gathered about 2,000 armed supporters, each of whom would have been paid 2 billion marks, worth just over $3 on this particular day, from a hoard of more than 14,000 billion marks confiscated from 2 supposedly Jewish banknote printers in raids carried out by brown shirt squads on Hitler's orders. The column set off at midday on November 9th, and, encouraged by the cheers of their supporters, they marched through the center of the city in the direction of the Ministry of War. At the end of the street, they were met by an armed cordon of police. According to the official report, they pressed pistols with their safety catches off against the policemen's chests, spat on them, and pointed fixed bayonets in their direction. Then, someone on one side or the other, there were conflicting claims, fired a shot. For half a minute, the air was filled with whizzing bullets as both sides let fly. Goering fell, shot in the leg. Hitler dropped or was pushed to the ground, dislocating his shoulder. Schubner Richter, Hitler's diplomat friend and connection to patrons in high places, was killed outright. Altogether, 14 marchers were shot dead and 4 policemen. As the police moved in to arrest Ludendorff, Streicher, Röhm, and many others, Goering managed to get away, fleeing first to Austria, then Italy, before settling in Sweden, becoming addicted in the process to the morphine he took to relieve the pain of his wound. Hitler was taken off, his arm in a sling, to Hanfstengel's country house, where he was arrested on November 11th. The putsch had come to an ignominious end. Jesus. There you go. Ugh, fuck. Okay. I feel like I'm getting a sore throat. It did not take Hitler long to recover his nerve after the events of November 9th, 1923. He knew that he could implicate a whole range of prominent Bavarian politicians in the putsch attempt, and expose the army's involvement in training paramilitaries for a march on Berlin. Aware of this threat, which had emerged already during Hitler's interrogation, the Bavarian government managed to persuade the authorities in Berlin to hold a trial not in the Reich court in Leipzig, but before a specially constituted People's Court in Munich, where they had more control over events. It seems likely that they offered Hitler leniency in return for his agreement to carry the can. As judge, they picked Georg Neithart, a well-known nationalist who had been appointed by Bavaria's reactionary Justice Minister Franz Günther in 1919 and had presided over Hitler's previous trial early in 1922. When the trial began on February 26, 1924, Hitler was allowed to appear in civilian dress, wearing his Iron Cross, and to address the court for hours on end without interruption. While Neithart let him bully and insult prosecution witnesses, the state prosecutor failed to call a number of key figures whose testimony would have proved damaging to the defense case. The court suppressed evidence of Ludendorff's involvement, and rejected a plea for Hitler to be deported as an Austrian citizen because he had served in the German army and shown himself to be a German patriot. Hitler took the entire responsibility on himself, declaring that serving the interests of Germany could not be high treason. The eternal court of history, he declared, will judge us as Germans who wanted the best for their people and their fatherland. Despite the fact that the participants in the putsch had shot dead 4 policemen and staged an armed, and in any reasonable legal terms, treasonable revolt against a legitimately constituted state government, both offenses punishable by death, the court sentenced Hitler to a mere 5 years in prison for high treason, and the others were indicted to similar or even lighter terms. Ludendorff, as expected, was acquitted. The court Ludendorff, was he the famous pilot guy that was now like doing politics as well? Or is that a different name? No. Who was the other guy? Was Ludendorff another far-right politician dude who had a lot of political power? He was a World War I general. He was a general. Okay. You're thinking of Göring. Oh, maybe. The court grounded its leniency in the fact that, as it declared, the participants in the putsch were led in their action by a pure, patriotic spirit and the most noble will. The judgment was scandalous, even by the biased standards of the Weimar judiciary. It was widely condemned, even on the right. Hitler was sent to an ancient fortress at Landsberg am Lech, west of Munich, where he took over the cell held up to that point by Count Arco Valley, the assassin of Kurt Eisner. This was what was called fortress incarceration, a mild form of imprisonment for offenders thought to have acted from honorable motives, such as, before the war, gentlemen of honor who had killed their opponent in a duel. Hitler's cell was large, airy, and comfortably furnished. Visitors had free access. Over 500 of them came during the course of his stay. They brought him presents, flowers, letters, and telegrams from well-wishers outside. He was able to read. Indeed, there was little else to do when he was not receiving visitors, and he plowed his way through a variety of books by authors such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, searching them in the main for confirmation of his own views. More importantly, at the suggestion of the Nazi publisher Max Amann, Hitler also sat down to dictate an account of his life and opinions up to this point to 2 of his fellow prisoners, his chauffeur Emil Maurice and his factotum, Rudolf Hess, an account published the following years under the title, probably proposed by Amann, of My Struggle. My Struggle has been seen by some historians as a kind of blueprint for Hitler's later actions, a dangerous and devilish book that was unfortunately ignored by those who should have known better. It was nothing of the kind. Heavily edited by Amann, Stengel, and others, in order to make it more literate and less incoherent than the rambling first draft, it was nonetheless turgid and tedious and sold only modest numbers of copies before the Nazis achieved their electoral breakthrough in 1930. After that, it became a bestseller, above all during the Third Reich, when not to own a copy was almost an act of treason. Those people who read it, probably a relatively small proportion of those who bought it, must have found it difficult to gain anything very coherent out of its confused melange of autobiographical reminiscences and garbled political declamations. Hitler's talent for winning hearts and minds lay in his public oratory, not in his writing. Still, no one who read the book could have been left in any doubt about the fact that Hitler considered racial conflict to be the motor, the essence of history, and the Jews to be the sworn enemy of the German race, whose historic mission it was, under the guidance of the Nazi Party, to break their international power and annihilate them entirely. The nationalization of our masses, he declared, will succeed only when, aside from all the positive struggle for the soul of our people, their international poisoners are exterminated. The Jews were now linked indissolubly, unable to be dissolved from, Jesus, in Hitler's mind, with Bolshevism and Marxism, which received far greater prominence in My Struggle than the finance capitalism that had so obsessed at the same time as the elimination of the Jewish Bolsheviks who he supposed ruled the Russian state, or the Soviet state. These ideas were laid out in more detail in the book's second volume, composed in 1925 and published the following year. They were central to Hitler's ideology from now on. The boundaries of the year 1914 mean nothing at all for the German future, he declared. Drawing a comparison with the vast eastern conquests of Alexander the Great, he announced that the end of Jewish rule in Russia will also be the end of Russia as a state. The soil now occupied by Russia and her vassal border states would in future be given over to the industrious work of the German plow. Based. Hitler's beliefs were clearly laid out in My Struggle for all to see who wished to. No one familiar with the text could have emerged from reading it with the view that all Hitler wanted was the revision of the Treaty of Versailles, the restoration of the German borders of 1914, or the self-determination of German-speaking minorities in Central Europe. Nor could anyone have doubted the visceral, fanatical, indeed murderous quality of his anti-Semitism. But beliefs and intentions are not the same as blueprints and plans. When it came to working out how to implement these views, Hitler's text naturally reflected the politics of the particular period in which it was written. At this time, the French were the enemy, having only recently withdrawn from the Ruhr. The British, by contrast, looked like a possible ally in the struggle against Bolshevism, having lent their support to the White forces in the Russian Civil War only a few years before. A little later, when Hitler composed another, similar work, unpublished during his lifetime, the clash between Italy and Germany over the South Tyrol was on the international agenda, and so he concentrated on that. What remained central through all of the tactical twists and turns, however, was the long-term drive for living space in the East and the fierce desire to annihilate the Jews. This, again, could not be done all at once, and Hitler obviously, at this stage, had no clear idea as to how it would be achieved or when. Here, too, there would be tactical maneuvers along the way, and a variety of interim solutions would present themselves. But none of this affected the genocidal quality of Hitler's hatred of the Jews, or his paranoid conviction that they were responsible for all of Germany's ills, and that the only long-term solution was their complete annihilation as a biological entity, a conviction easily discernible not only from the language of My Struggle, but also from the words and phrases he used in his speeches, and the atmosphere of revivalist intolerance in which they were held. The Jews were a pestilence, worse than the Black Death, a maggot in the decomposing body of Germany, and they would be driven from what he thought of as their positions of power and then expelled from the country altogether, if necessary, by force. What would happen to the Jews of Eastern Europe once Germany had acquired its living space there, he could not say, but the murderous violence of his language left little doubt that their fate would not be a pleasant one. The composition of his book, the massive publicity he gained from the trial, and the adulation that poured in from the nationalist right after the attempted push, all helped convince Hitler, if he had not been convinced before, that he was the man to turn these views into reality. The failed putsch also taught him that he would not even be able to take the first step, the acquisition of supreme power in Germany itself, by relying on paramilitary violence alone. A march on Rome was out of the question in Germany. It was essential to win mass public support by the propaganda and public-speaking campaigns which Hitler knew were his forte. The revolutionary conquest of power, still favored by Rome, would not work in any case if it was undertaken without the support of the army, so conspicuously lacking in November of 1923. Hitler did not, as was sometimes later said, even by himself, embark on a path of legality in the wake of the failed putsch, but he did realize that toppling the Weimar system would require more than a few ill-directed gunshots, even in a year of supreme crisis such as 1923. Coming to power clearly required collaboration from key elements in the establishment, and although he had enjoyed some support in 1923, it had not proved sufficient. In the next crisis, which was to occur less than a decade later, he made sure he had the army and the key institutions of the state either neutralized or actively working for him, unlike in 1923. Meanwhile, however, the situation of the Nazi Party seemed almost irretrievable in the wake of Hitler's arrest and imprisonment. The paramilitary groups broke up in disorder, and their arms were confiscated by the government. Kahr, Lossow, and Caesar, badly compromised by the putsch, were pushed aside by a new cabinet under the Bavarian People's Party leader, Heinrich Held. Bavarian separatism and ultranationalist conspiracies gave way to a more conventional regional politics. The situation calmed down as the hyperinflation came to an end, its an end, and the policy of fulfillment took hold in Berlin, bearing fruit almost immediately with the rescheduling of reparations under the Dawes Plan. Deprived of their leader, the Nazis split up into tiny, squabbling factions again. Rome continued to try and reunite the remaining fragments of the paramilitaries in allegiance to Ludendorff. Hitler put Alfred Rosenberg in charge of the Nazi Party as virtually the only leading figure left in the country who was still at large. But Rosenberg proved completely incapable of establishing any authority over the movement. Both the Nazi Party and the Brown Shirts were now illegal organizations. They were completely unprepared for a clandestine existence. Clandestine. I think it's clandestine. Clandestine existence, secretive. Opinions differed widely on what tactics to use in future, paramilitary or parliamentary, and rivalries between figures like Streicher and Ludendorff, as well as the congeries of ultranationalist groups who emerged to try to claim the Nazi succession, were crippling attempts to resurrect the movement. Hitler more or less washed his hands of all these squabbles, announcing his withdrawal from politics to write his book. Matters were not much improved when Hitler was released on parole by a decision of the Bavarian Supreme Court and against the advice of the state prosecutorial service on December 20th, 1924. He still had almost 4 years of his sentence to run, during which he had to be careful not to violate the conditions of his parole. He was not allowed to speak in public in most parts of Germany until 1927. He was still banned in Prussia, which covered over half of the Weimar Republic's land surface and contained the majority of its population, as late as 1928. The ultranationalist right was humiliated in the national elections of 1924. The only ray of sunshine in the gloom was provided by the Austrian government, which scotched official attempts to get Hitler repatriated by refusing to accept him. Nevertheless, Hitler still had a few friends in high places. One key figure was the Bavarian Justice Minister, Franz Gürtner, who sympathized with his nationalist ideas. Gürtner agreed to lift the ban on the Nazi Party and its newspaper, the Racial Observer, when the Bavarian state of emergency was finally ended on February 16, 1925. Armed with his newly won prestige and self-confidence as the nationalist hero of the Putsch and the subsequent trial, Hitler promptly refounded the Nazi Party, calling on his former followers to join it and, a key new point, to submit themselves unconditionally to his leadership. Julius Streicher, Gottfried Feder, the party journalist, and propagandist Hermann Esser, and others publicly buried their differences in a show of solidarity. Hitler moved to push his most serious rivals out onto the margins of politics. First, as it became legal to reconstitute the Brown Shirt organization, he insisted that it be subordinated to the party and cut its links with the other paramilitary groups. Ernst Röhm, who rejected this view, was ousted, left politics, and was forced to become a salesman and then a factory hand before accepting an invitation to go to Bolivia to instruct the country's troops in the ways of European warfare. And secondly, Hitler worked steadily to undermine the continuing prestige of Ludendorff, who was not only a serious rival, but was also rapidly becoming more extreme in his views. Under the influence of Mathilde von Chemnitz, whom he married in 1926, Ludendorff founded the Tannenberg League, which published conspiracy theory literature attacking not only Jews, but also Jesuits and the Catholic Church, a certain recipe for electoral disaster in Bavaria and other pious parts of southern Germany. Ludendorff's fate was sealed when he stood as a candidate for the presidency in the 1925 elections on behalf of the Nazi Party and received a derisory 1.1% of the vote. There is some evidence that Hitler himself had persuaded him to stand in the knowledge that his reputation would be irreparably harmed by the attempt. From now until his death in 1937, Ludendorff and his Tannenberg League remained on the fringes of politics, condemned to complete irrelevance and lacking in any kind of mass support. Nothing demonstrated more clearly than this the changed situation of extreme nationalism in Germany. The all-powerful military dictator of the First World War had been pushed out to the margins of politics by the upstart Nazi politician, and the general had been displaced by the corporal. With Ludendorff safely out of the way, Hitler had no serious rival on the extreme right anymore. He could now concentrate on bringing the rest of the ultranationalist movement to heel. While disparate groups in the South gravitated into the orbit of the Nazi Party, the various branches of the party in northern and western Germany were undergoing something of a revival. The person mainly responsible for this was another Bavarian, Gregor Strasser, a pharmacist from Landshut. Born in 1892, the son of a politically active lawyer, Strasser was well educated and well read, and his middle-class upbringing and manners made him an attractive figure in the eyes of many potential sympathizers of the Nazi movement. At the same time, like many bourgeois German men of his generation, he was stamped by the experience of 1914, the spirit of unity that he believed needed to be recreated among all Germans. After finishing his military service as a lieutenant, Strasser sought to recreate this experience and to right what he believed to be Germany's wrongs. He fought with the Free Corps in Munich at the end of the war, and then built up his own paramilitary group, which brought him into contact with Hitler. For Strasser, it was the cause rather than the leader that mattered. On November 9th, 1923, he led his brown shirt unit into Munich to seize a key bridge over the river, as arranged, and when the putsch backfired, he took his unit back to Landshut again, where he was duly arrested. But in the end, his rather peripheral participation in the putsch did not seem to the authorities to warrant particularly harsh treatment. Strasser, therefore, remained at large, while the other Nazi leaders either fled or were landed in jail. In April of 1924, he was elected to the Bavarian parliament. He proved to be a talented administrator, bringing together many of the fragments of the shattered ultra-right. Once the Nazi Party was legal again, Hitler, recognizing his ability, sent him to revive it in North Germany. By the end of 1915, Strasser's tireless recruitment drive had increased the number of branches nearly fourfold, using a pronounced emphasis on the socialist aspect of Nazi ideology to try and win over the industrial working class in areas like the Ruhr. Strasser was contemptuous of the other ultra-right groups, which thought the primitive solution of anti-Semitism to be adequate. He told Oswald Spengler in July of 1925 that Nazism was different because it sought a German revolution through a German form of socialism. His idea of socialism, however, while it involved the state taking a 51% stake in major industries and a 49% in all other businesses, also included the return of the guilds and the payment of wages in kind rather than in money. Socialist ideas of this kind were developed by Strasser in conjunction with a number of Nazi leaders in the new branches of the party in various parts of North Germany. These party branches owed little or nothing to the leadership of Hitler during this period. The party, as it were, was largely reconstituting itself independently of headquarters in Munich. Soon, perhaps inevitably, Strasser and his allies were voicing their suspicions of what they regarded as the corrupt and dictatorial clique under Hermann Esser that was running the party's Munich office while Hitler was composing the second volume of My Struggle. Many of them had not even met Hitler in person, and so had not fallen under the spell of his growing personal charisma. They particularly disliked the existing Nazi Party program and declared their intention of replacing it with one more in tune with their own ideas. Particularly prominent in these moves was another new recruit to the party, the young ideologue Joseph Goebbels. Born in 1897 in the industrial town of Reich on the Lower Rhine, son of a clerk, Goebbels was given a grammar school education and went on to study ancient philology, German, and history at Bonn University, gaining a PhD in Romantic literature at Heidelberg University in 1921, which entitled him to be addressed, as he was ever after, as Dr. Goebbels. Destiny, I saw on the Philip DeFranco show that NATO wants America out of the alliance in between 5 to 10 years. Is America cooked? Also, Trump is shutting down FEMA. Is America over? Are we cooked? I don't know, bro. We'll figure it out. I don't think NATO wants America to leave. That just might be the current thing that people are worried about. But despite his doctorate, Goebbels was not destined for the academic life. He, too, was a kind of bohemian, already occupying his spare time in his student days with writing plays and dreaming of an artistic future. Throughout the 1920s, he wrote and rewrote the novel that was eventually published in 1925 as Michael, A German Fate in the Pages of a Diary. The novel was mainly a vehicle for Goebbels' own vague and confused conception of a national revival based on fanatical faith and belief in the future, for which the novel's hero eventually sacrifices himself. By such means, Goebbels sought to give meaning to a life dominated by his own very obvious physical disability, a club foot, which made him walk with a limp. It exposed him to merciless teasing at school, and indeed throughout his life, and rendered him unfit for military service in the First World War. Perhaps in compensation, Goebbels came to believe that he was destined for great things. He kept a diary, he pursued women and love affairs with extraordinary vigor and a surprising degree of success, and he spurned any ordinary means of earning a living. Instead, he read avidly Dostoevsky, right? Nietzsche, Spengler, and above all, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who convinced him that the rebirth of the West prophesied by Spengler could only be achieved by the removal of the Jews. Dostoevsky? Fuck this guy. And fuck old authors.
Dostoevsky. Goebbels.
Cringe. Goebbels was different in some ways from the other leading Nazis. His intellect and temperament were often described as Latin, perhaps because he avoided vague philosophical and rhetorical declamation and instead spoke and wrote with a remarkable clarity and openness, mixed on occasion with sarcastic humor. Like many others, however, he had been profoundly shocked by Germany's defeat in the First World War. He spent the winter semester of 1919 to 1920 in Munich. It was common for German students to change universities at least once during their studies. And so, as well as being exposed to the extreme right-wing atmosphere of student life, he now imbibed the rabidly nationalist atmosphere of the counter-revolution in the city in those months. Although he sympathized with men like Count Arco Valli, whose imprisonment for the assassination of Kurt Eisner deeply dismayed him, Goebbels did not really discover his political commitment or his political abilities until 1924, when, after coming into contact with a number of ultranationalist groups, he was introduced to the Nazi Party by an old school friend. As Goebbels made his way in the Nazi Party, he met Erich Koch. Holy shit, the Koch brothers. Just kidding. A Rhenish Nazi and former member of the violent wing of resistance against the French. He also encountered Julius Streicher, whom he described privately as a berserker and perhaps somewhat pathological. And he was impressed by Ludendorff, whom he had already admired as the great general from the First World War. Soon, Goebbels had become a party organizer in the Rhineland. He developed into an effective orator, perhaps the most effective of all the Nazi speakers, apart from Hitler himself, lucid, popular, and quick-witted in response to hecklers. He began turning his literary talents to political use in articles for the Nazi press, giving a pseudo-socialist twist to the Nazi creed. Goebbels had finally found his métier. I don't know what the fuck that means. A thing he had a penchant for. Okay. Within a few months, he was one of the most popular Nazi orators in the Rhineland, attracting the attention of leading figures in the regional party and starting to play a significant role in deciding its policy. It was Joseph Goebbels, as much as Gregor Strasser, who was behind the North German challenge to the Munich Party leadership in 1925. But he too soon began to fall under Hitler's spell, enthused by a reading of My Struggle. "Who is this man," he wrote, "half plebeian, half god?" Meeting him in person for only the second time on November 6, 1925, Goebbels was impressed by his big blue eyes, like stars. Hitler was, he thought, after hearing him speak, the born tribune of the people, the coming dictator. Wow. Goebbels and Hitler failed to see eye to eye on many central issues. Alerted to the growing assertiveness of the North Germans, Hitler summoned them to a meeting on February 14, 1926, in Bamberg, Franconia, where Julius Streicher had built up a large following for him. The Nazi leader spoke for 2 hours, rejecting their views and reasserting his belief in the centrality of the conquest of living space in Eastern Europe for the future of German foreign policy, whereas Strasser and Goebbels had urged the Nazis to join in the campaign to expropriate the German princes who had retained their extensive properties in the country after their deposition in the Revolution of 1918. Hitler damned such a campaign as an attack on private property. "Horrifying," wrote Goebbels in his diary, "probably one of the greatest disappointments of my life. I no longer believe fully in Hitler." But although Goebbels now wondered whether Hitler was a reactionary, he did not offer any overt opposition to Hitler at the meeting. Shocked at Hitler's tough stance, Strasser capitulated completely and dropped his proposals. In return, Hitler mollified the North Germans by removing Hermann Esser, whose corruption had so angered them, from his post in Munich. In April of 1926, Hitler brought Goebbels to Munich to give a speech, providing him with a car and generally giving him the red carpet treatment. At Nazi Party headquarters, Hitler confronted Goebbels, fuck these names, Goebbels, and his two co-leaders of the Westphalian region of the party, Franz Teffer von Solomon, another leading North German Nazi, and, like so many leading Nazis, an ex-army man and Free Corps member, and Karl Kaufmann, who had made his name by organizing violent resistance to the French during their occupation of the Ruhr. Hitler berated these men for going their own way in ideological matters, lecturing them on his views of the party's policies, then offered to let bygones be bygones if they submitted unconditionally to his leadership. To his leadership. Goebbels was converted on the spot. Hitler, he confided to his diary, was brilliant. Adolf Hitler, he wrote, thinking of the 1923 PUTSCH, I love you because you are both great and simple at the same time, what one calls a genius. From now on, he was entirely under Hitler's spell. Unlike some of the other Nazi leaders, he was to remain so right up to the right up to the end. Hitler rewarded him by putting him in charge of the tiny and internally divided Nazi party in Berlin as regional leader, or Gauleiter. Teffer von Solomon was made head of the brown-shirt paramilitaries, and Gregor Strasser became Reich propaganda leader of the party. Meanwhile, the annual party meeting reaffirmed the 1920 party program and underlined Hitler's total dominance over the movement, placing all the key appointments, and in particular, those of the regional leaders, in his hands. This meeting was required by law, and following legal requirements, it duly re-elected Hitler as party leader. The true nature of the party's inner workings was demonstrated, however, by a party rally held in July of 1926 and attended by up to 8,000 brown shirts and party members. Its time was almost wholly taken up with rituals and obeisance to Hitler, the swearing of personal oaths of loyalty to him, and mass marches and displays, including the parading of the blood flag that had been held above the ill-fated march on Munich in November of 1923. This set the tone, in a modest way, for the far more grandiose party rallies of future years. But at this point, though now united and disciplined under Hitler's unquestioned leadership, the Nazi Party was still very small. The developments of the following 3 years, up to late 1929, would lay the foundation for the party's subsequent success. But more would be required than leadership and organization if the Nazis were to gain the popular backing that Hitler now sought. Wow, are they going to be able to do it? It's like a ragtag group of political people fighting against all odds. Okay. The years 1927 to 1928 saw the creation of a new basic structure for the Nazi Party across the country. In 1928, the party regions were realigned to follow the boundaries of the Reichstag constituencies, only 35 of them, all very large, to conform to Weimar's system of proportional representation by party list to signal the primacy of their electoral functions. Okay. Within a year or so of this, a new intermediate organizational layer of districts, Kreis, had been created between the regions and the local branches. A new generation of younger Nazi activists played the most prominent role at these levels. They pushed aside the generations left over from pre-war pan-German and conspiratorial organizations and outnumbered those who had taken an active part in the Free Corps, the Thule Society, and similar groups. But it is important to remember that even the older generation of leading Nazis were themselves still young men, particularly when compared with the graying, middle-aged politicians who led the mainstream political parties. One thing I was going to say that was kind of surprising, and I feel like this might have been the case, I think, for Israel's history as well, a little bit, maybe, is a lot of the people that are in leadership positions in Israel are pretty youngish people, I guess, compared to what I would expect, whose formative years are all during World War, during big wars, big conflict on the ground. I guess for America, I don't know how old Washington was when he became president, but I feel like they're all generals. Like it's, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing or just an observational thing, but Hitler was still, in 1929, Hitler was still only 40, Goebbels 32, Göring 36, Hess 35, Gregor Strasser 37. Their role remained crucial, especially in providing leadership and inspiration to the younger generation. Goebbels, for example, made his reputation above all as regional leader of Berlin, where his fiery speeches, his incessant activity, his outrageous provocations of the Nazis' opponents, and his calculated staging of street fights and meeting hall brawls to gain the attention of the press won the party a massive new adherents. More publicity accrued from the Berlin Party's aggressive and extremely defamatory campaigns against figures such as the Berlin deputy police chief, Bernhard Weiss, whose Jewish descent Goebbels drew attention to through calling him Isidore, an entirely made-up name commonly used by anti-Semites for Jews. Isn't that what they called Aragorn? Was he Isildur's heir? Or the heir of? Is that? Was Tolkien a little bit? No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. An entirely made-up name. Blah, 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 blah. Ironically, and borrowed on this occasion, ironically, from the communist press. Goebbels' violence and extremism earned the Nazi Party in Berlin an 11-month ban from the city's social democratic authorities in 1927 to 1928. But they also won him the allegiance and admiration of younger activists, such as the 19-year-old Horst Wessel, a pastor's son who had abandoned his university law studies for the world of the paramilitaries, most recently the Brown Shirts. Brown Shirts is referring to the Free Corps, right? Or is it more specifically referring to paramilitaries just working or generally with the Nazi Party? What are Brown Shirts just the paramilitary guys associated with the Nazi Party at this point? No, SA. Okay. Wait, what does SA stand for again? Proto-SS. Sturmagteilung. Okay, gotcha. Based. They're the street fighters. Okay, they're the street fighters for the Nazis in particular then. Okay. What this man has shown in oratorical gifts and talent for organization, he wrote of R. Goebbels in 1929, is unique. The essay would have let itself be hacked to bits for him. Essay where the brown shirts like, okay. A great deal of infighting took place over key posts in the party organization at a local and regional level. On the whole, however, as Maximon told one local activist towards the end of 1925, Hitler takes the view on principle that it is not the job of the party leadership to install branch leaders. Hitler takes the view today, more than ever, that the most effective fighter in the National Socialist movement is the man who pushes his way through on the basis of his achievements as a leader. If you yourself write that you enjoy the trust of almost all the members in Hanover, why don't you then take over the leadership of the branch? ? In this way, Hitler thought, the most ruthless, the most dynamic, and the most efficient would rise to positions of power within the movement. That's why I let my mods get decided. They fight to the death. He was later to apply the same principle in running the Third Reich. It helped ensure that the Nazi Party at every level became ceaselessly active, constantly marching, fighting, demonstrating, mobilizing. Yet, this did not bring immediate rewards. By the end of 1927, the party still had only some 75,000 members and a mere 7 deputies elected to the Reichstag. The hopes of men like Strasser and Goebbels that it would be able to win over the industrial working class had proved to be illusory. Recognizing the difficulties of breaking into the social democratic and communist heartlands, the Nazis turned instead to rural society in Protestant North Germany, where rising peasant discontent was spilling over into demonstrations and campaigns of protest. The contradictory effects of inflation and stabilization on the farming community had merged into a general crisis of agriculture by the late 1920s, while large landowners and farmers had bought machinery on hire purchase and were thus able to modernize at very little real cost to themselves. Peasants tended to hoard money and so lost it, or spend it on domestic goods and so gained no benefit for their businesses. After the inflation, government measures to ease credit restrictions on agriculture to help recovery only made things worse, as peasants borrowed heavily to make good their losses, expecting a fresh round of inflation, then found that they were unable to pay the money back because prices were declining instead of rising. Bankruptcies and foreclosures were already rising in number towards the end of the 1920s, and small farmers were turning to the extreme right in their despair. Larger farmers and big landowners were suffering from the downturn in agricultural prices and were unable to pay what they regarded as excessively high taxes to support the Weimar welfare state. Both the Prussian and the Reich governments had tried to alleviate the situation by tariffs, subsidies, import controls, and the like, but all these proved wholly inadequate to the situation. Farmers of all types had modernized, mechanized, and rationalized in order to try and deal with the agricultural depression since the early 1920s, but it was not enough. Pressure for high import tariffs on foodstuffs grew more insistent as the farming community began to see this as the only way to protect their income. In this situation, the Nazis' promise of a self-sufficient, autarkic Germany with foreign food imports more or less banned seemed increasingly attractive. Because I think Hitler's view was that Germany should be an autarky that makes and produces all of its own stuff without needing any imports from any other country. Realizing that they were winning support in rural areas in the Protestant North without really trying, the Nazis accelerated the shift in their propaganda from the urban working class to other sectors of the population. Now, the party turned its attention to rural districts and began to mount serious recruiting drives in areas like Schleswig, Holstein, and Oldenburg. Hitler retreated still further from the socialist orientation of the party in North Germany and even clarified, or in other words, amended, Point 17 of the party program on April 13, 1928, in order to reassure small farmers that its commitment to the expropriation of land for communal purposes without compensation referred only to Jewish companies which speculate in land. The Nazis lost 100,000 votes in the Reichstag elections of May 1928, and with a mere 2.6% of the vote, were only able to get 12 deputies into the legislature, among them Gottfried Feder, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, and Gregor Strasser. Nonetheless, in some rural areas of the Protestant North, they did much better. While they could only manage 1.4% in Berlin and 1.3% in the Ruhr, for example, they scored no less than 18.1 and 17.7%, respectively, in two counties in Schleswig-Holstein. A vote of 8.1% in another area inhabited by discontented Protestant small farmers, namely Franconia, reinforced the feeling that, as the party newspaper put it on May 31st, the election results from the rural areas in particular proved that with a smaller expenditure of energy, money, and time, better results could be achieved there than in the big cities. The party soon revamped its propaganda appeal to the farming community, telling them that it would create a special position for them in the Third Reich. Farmers of all kinds would be granted a corporation of their own, in which they would work together in harmony and with the full backing of the state. Refractory farmhands, many of whom were active in the Social Democratic Party, would be brought to heel, and labor costs would at last come under tight control. After years of unsuccessful, sometimes violent protests, farmers in Schleswig-Holstein flocked to the support of the Nazi Party. It did no harm to its cause that the party was led locally by members of the farming community, nor that it laid unmistakable stress on an ideology of blood and soil in which the peasant would be the core of the national identity. Even some of the larger landowners, traditionally identified with the nationalists, were convinced. The Nazi Party's support amongst middling and small landowners skyrocketed. Soon, farmers' sons were providing the manpower for stormtrooper units being dispatched to fight the communists in the big cities. Thus, the new strategy soon began to bear fruit. The party's membership grew from 100,000 in October of 1928 to 150,000 a year later. While in local and state elections, its vote now began to increase sharply, rising to 5% in Saxony, 4% in Mecklenburg, and 7% in Baden. In some rural areas of Protestant Saxony, it nearly doubled its share of the vote, increasing, for example, from 5.9% in the Schwarzenberg district in 1928 to 11.4% in 1929. In June of 1929, the Nazi Party took over its first municipality, the Franconian town of Coburg. Here, they won 13 out of the 25 seats on the council in the wake of a successful campaign for the removal of the previous council after it had sacked the local Nazi leader, a municipal employee, for making anti-Semitic speeches. The victory reflected in part the huge effort the party had put into the elections, with top speakers like Hermann Göring and even Hitler himself appearing at the hustings. But it also demonstrated that there was electoral capital to be won in local politics, where the party now became much more active than before. Okay. And in the autumn of 1929, there was a further electoral bonus for the party in the shape of the campaign against the Young Plan, which involved the reduction and rescheduling of reparation payments, but not their abolition, organized by the nationalists. Their leader, Alfred Hugenberg, enlisted the support of the Nazis and other ultra-right groups in his efforts to win acceptance for a referendum on his proposal for a law to reject the plan and prosecute any government ministers who signed it. Not only did the Nazis gain publicity from this campaign, they also won a degree of respectability on the mainstream right through the presence of Hitler on the organizing committee, along with such pan-German stalwarts as Heinrich Class and the steel helmet leaders Franz Selt and Theodor Duisterberg, I don't know. The referendum itself was a failure, with only 5.8 million votes in favor, but the campaign had revealed to many supporters of the nationalists how much more dynamic the brown-shirted and jackbooted Nazis were than the frock-coated and top-hatted leadership of their own party. Meanwhile, Hitler was soon whipping up popular enthusiasm again, his charisma now reinforced by the leadership cult that had grown up around him within the party. An important symbolic expression of this was the use of the German greeting, Hail Hitler, with outstretched right arm, whether or not Hitler was present. Made compulsory in the movement in 1926, it was also used increasingly as a sign-off in correspondence. These customs reinforced the movement's total dependence on Hitler and were enthusiastically propagated by the second tier of leaders who had now gathered around him, whether, as with Gregor Strasser, for tactical reasons, to cement the party's unity, or, as with Rudolf Hess, out of blind religious faith to the person of the leader, as he was now generally known. At the party rally held in Nuremberg in August of 1929, and the first such meeting since 1927, the party's newfound confidence and coherence was demonstrated in a huge propaganda display attended, so the police thought, by as many as 40,000 people, all united in their adulation for the leader. By this time, the Nazi Party had become a formidable organization, its regional, district, and local levels staffed with loyal and energetic functionaries, many of them well-educated and administratively competent, and its propaganda appeal channeled through a network of specialist institutions directed at particular constituents of the electorate. Despite Hitler's repeated insistence that politics was a matter for men, there was now a Nazi women's organization, the self-styled German Women's Order, founded by Elsbeth Zander in 1923 and incorporated as a Nazi Party affiliate in 1928. Its membership was estimated by the police to have reached 4,000 by the end of the decade, nearly half the Nazi Party's total female membership of 7,625. The German Women's Order was one of those paradoxical women's organizations that campaigned actively in public for the removal of women from public life, militantly anti-socialist, anti-feminist, and anti-Semitic. Its practical activities included running soup kitchens for brown shirts, helping with propaganda campaigns, hiding weapons and equipment for the Nazi paramilitaries when they were being sought by the police, and providing nursing services for wounded activists through its sub-organization, the Red Swastika, a Nazi version of the Red Cross. Zander was an effective speaker by all accounts, but she was not much of an organizer, and early in 1931, her German Women's Order collapsed amid a wetler of accusations and counter-accusations, of which the charge of financial corruption was the most serious. The order was so deeply in debt that Zander herself, as the responsible official, faced personal bankruptcy. In addition, there were scurrilous reports that Zander was having with the National Socialist Women's Organization, NS Frauenschaft. Good one. which was initially at least a decentralized body with its regional associations controlled by the regional leaders. Soon, however, it was successful enough to acquire a nationwide identity with its own magazine for women and not only a greater degree of autonomy for its own regional leaders, but also a greater degree of coordination between them. The fundamental problem for Nazi women, however, lay in the party's ineradicable male chauvinism, a conviction that women's role was not to take part in politics, but to stay at home and bear children based. For the time being, it had to compromise its position in the interest of winning over female voters, but in the long run, if the Nazis ever came to power, its anti-feminist women activists seemed doomed to argue themselves out of a role. Alongside the organizations catering for women, there was also one directed at youths aged between 14 and 18, founded in 1922. This initially had the rather cumbersome title of the Youth League of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, but in 1926 it was renamed the DGG Youth. That's DGG Youth. That's opposed to the Republic. It, too, met with little success to begin with. Even in January of 1932, it only had 1,000 members in the whole of Berlin. Backing it up was a National Socialist School Pupils League, founded in 1929, and a League of German Maidens, established the following year. Okay. Okay. Von Schirach, who proved to be a durable and increasingly important figure in the Nazi movement. Born in 1907 in Berlin, he was the son of a traditionalist ex-army theater director in Weimar who was married to a wealthy American woman. Schirach? Is that Schirach or Chirac? Chirac? Schirach grew up in culturally conservative anti-Semitic circles in Weimar. He was educated at a boarding school whose head emphasized character building rather than academic education. The young Schirach was profoundly influenced by his elder brother's suicide in October of 1919, announced in a letter to his family as a response to Germany's misfortune. By the mid-1920s, he was reading Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and when he discovered Hitler's My Struggle, he was converted to Nazism, developing his commitment into real hero worship when he heard Hitler speak in the town in 1925. Soon he attracted the leader's attention with a seemingly endless outpouring of poems glorifying the movement and its chief. They had been described as superior to their outpourings of other racist versifiers and were published in a collected volume in 1929. During his studies in Munich, which he never completed, loser, he joined the National Socialist German Students' League, quickly rising to the top of the branch based at Munich University, where he had been advised to study by Hitler. It was his success in this capacity that propelled him to the leadership of the National League in 1928, replacing Wilhelm Tempel. See how important a college education is? Schirach purged the League of its social revolutionary elements and led it in extremely vigorous campaigning for seats on the student unions of individual universities. Pushing aside the traditional, rather stuffy dueling corps and fraternities, the League gained a reputation for provocative actions and campaigned on issues such as the reduction of overcrowding in lectures by imposing a limit on the number of Jewish students, the dismissal of pacifist professors, the creation of new chairs in subjects like racial studies and military science, and the harnessing of the universities to the national interest, away from the pursuit of knowledge as an end in itself. By the summer of 1932, they had already gained a much-trumpeted success in combination with right-wing professors and local politicians in hounding Emil Julius Gumbel, a particularly hated figure as a Jew, a socialist, a pacifist, and a campaigner against right-wing judicial bias, from his chair in Heidelberg, prompting the declaration from a Frankfurt magazine that Heidelberg has thus opened the era of the Third Reich in the sphere of academia. Jeez, that guy hit all the checkboxes. Carefully avoiding antagonizing the fraternities, Schirach rapidly increased the League's vote in student elections, and in July of 1931, the League was able to take over the national organization of the General Students' Unions with the help of others sympathetic right-wing groups. In 1932, the students voted the leadership principle through the National Union, abolishing elections altogether. Even though total membership of the Nazi Students' League did not even reach 10% of national fraternity membership, the Nazis had completely taken over student representation in Germany. Impressed by such successes, Hitler appointed Reich to the leadership of the Hitler Youth on October 3rd, 1931. Not just women, young people, students, and school pupils, but also many other sectors of German society were catered for by specially designed Nazi organizations by the end of the 1920s. There were groups for civil servants, for the war wounded, for farmers, and for many other constituencies, each addressing its particular, specifically targeted propaganda effort. There was even a kind of trade union movement, which clumsily named National Socialist Factory Cell Organization, or the clumsily named National Socialist Factory Cell Organization, which met with a conspicuous lack of success in trying to attract industrial workers who were either already organized in socialist-oriented or Catholic or communist trade unions, or out of a job and so not in need of a trade union. Yet, the Nazis still had a particular appeal to the lower middle classes at this time, to artisans, shopkeepers, and the self-employed. Often, they gathered up such people from other similar movements. The German Nationalist Commercial Employees Union, for example, played a significant role in politicizing many young men and turning them in the direction of Nazism. Founded in the Wilhelmine period, it articulated the resentments of male clerks in a world where women were coming into secretarial and similar jobs in ever larger numbers, and big employers in the banks, finance corporations, insurance companies, and so on were often perceived as Jewish by religion, ethnic origin, or simply character. Well before the war, it had launched furious attacks on Jews as the architects of the proletarianization of their members. One junior civil servant, born in 1886, joined the Union in 1912 and later noted that he thought that the government was dominated by Jews even under the Kaiser. When he finally left the Nationalists for the Nazis in 1932, after attending a party rally, he noted that this was what I had been looking for since 1912. With many older Nazis from such backgrounds, it must have been the same. Strasser encouraged the establishment of this extremely elaborate structure of subdivisions within the movement, even if many of the different branches, like the Hitler Youth or the Factory Cell Organization, had very few members and did not seem to be going anywhere very fast. For he had a long-term aim in mind. All of this was intended to form the basis for the creation of a society run by Nazified social institutions once Hitler came to power. Strasser expended a great deal of energy and diplomacy in the creation of this embryonic Nazi social order. In the shorter run, it helped the party direct its electoral appeal towards virtually every constituency in German society, helping to politicize social institutions that had previously considered themselves more or less unpolitical in their nature. It meant that the party would be able to expand with ease should it suddenly gain a rapid influx of new members, and the whole structure was held together by unconditional loyalty to a leader whose power was now absolute and whose charisma was fed on a daily basis by the adulation of his immediate group of subordinates. Wow. The Nazi movement, as it had developed by the late 1920s, was dependent on the energy and fanaticism of its active members. Without them, it would have been just another political party. The Third Reich was created not least by the ordinary street-level members of the brown shirts and the Nazi Party. What was it then that bound young men to the Nazi movement with such a terrifyingly single-minded sense of commitment? Where did the wellsprings of brown shirt violence lie? Hitler's charisma obviously played a part, yet much of the party, especially in North Germany, came into being virtually without him. The dynamism of the movement had deeper roots. The autobiographies and diaries of a variety of leading Nazis provide some clues, and there is an excellent contemporary source that allows us some unique insights into the mindset of the Nazi activist. In 1934, the sociologist Theodor Abel, a professor at New York's Columbia University, obtained the cooperation of the Nazi Party for an essay competition in which people who had joined the party or the brown shirts before March 1st, 1933, were asked to write brief testimonies. Several hundred were sent in, and although both the party and the respondents saw this as an opportunity to impress Americans with the sincerity and commitment of their movement, Abel's insistence that the prize would go to the most honest and trustworthy account seems to have ensured a reasonable degree of accuracy, at least as far as the testimonies could be checked. For the grassroots party activist, the elaborate theories of men like Rosenberg, Chamberlain, Spengler, and other intellectuals were a closed book. Even popular writers, such as Lagarde and Langben, appealed mainly to the educated middle classes. Far more important were durable, popular, anti-Semitic propagandists such as Theodor Fritzsch, whose Handbook on the Jewish Question, published in 1888, reached its 40th edition in 1933. Stop. You know what you're doing. Honey. I know you're back there. Yeah, you're trying to knock my shit over. You don't need to do that. Chill. You have food, you have water, you have everything a cat could want. What do you need? Here. Oh my God, he's freaking out. What is going on? Jesus. What are you doing? Stop. He's trying to terrorize me. But no, you don't even need cables. Stop. You don't even like that. Here, come hang out right here. Look, you have a seat right here. Look. Come here. Come up here. Look. Honey. What? Why do you have to be down there? What? Okay. For the grassroots party, okay, blah, blah, blah. They couldn't read these big books. They read the small anti-Jew books. Frisch's publishing house, the Hammer Verlag, survived. I need a spray bottle. You're about to get Nerf gunned if you don't stop. Stop terrorizing me. Now you're being mean. Stop terrorizing me. Don't. Stop. Stop. Stop this. I want to say Frisch. Frisch's publishing house, the Hammer Verlag, survived the First World War and continued to produce a lot of popular pamphlets and tracts, which were quite widely read amongst rank-and-file Nazis. As one stormtrooper wrote in 1934, after the war, I became very much interested in politics and eagerly studied newspapers of all political shadings. In 1920, for the first time, I read in a right-wing newspaper an advertisement for an anti-Semitic periodical, became a subscriber of the Hammer of Theodor Frisch. With the help of this periodical, I got to know the devastating influence of the Jews on people, state, and economy. I must still admit today that this periodical was, for me, really the bridge to the great movement of Adolf Hitler. More significant still, however, was the inspiration provided by the basic elements of Nazi propaganda. The speeches by Hitler and Goebbels, the marches, the banners, the parades. At this level, ideas were more likely to be acquired through organs such as the Nazi press, election pamphlets, and wall posters than through serious ideological tracts. Among ordinary party activists in the 1920s and early 1930s, the most important aspect of Nazi ideology was its emphasis on social solidarity. The concept of the organic racial community of all Germans, followed at some distance by extreme nationalism and the cult of Hitler. Anti-Semitism, by contrast, was of significance only for a minority, and for a good proportion of these, it was only incidental. The younger they were, the less important ideology was at all, and the more significant were features such as the emphasis on Germanic culture and the leadership role of Hitler. By contrast, ideological anti-Semitism was strongest amongst the older generation of Nazis, testifying to the latent influence of anti-Semitic groups active before the war and the nationalistic families in which many of them had grown up. came to the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party after serving at the front in 1914 to 19. Rudolf Haas, for example, the future commandant of Auschwitz, came to the party this way. Born in 1901 in Baden-Baden, he grew up in southwest Germany in a Catholic family. His father, a salesman, intended him for the priesthood and, according to Haas, instilled in him a strong sense of duty and obedience. But he also intoxicated him with tales of his own past days as a soldier in Africa and the selflessness and heroism of the missionaries. Haas lost his faith as the result, he later wrote, of the betrayal of a secret he had confided in his confessor. When the war broke out, he enrolled in the Red Cross and then in his father's old regiment in 1916, serving in the Middle East. At the end of the war, his parents both dead, he enlisted in a Free Corps unit in the Baltic, where he experienced the brutality of civil war at first hand. Back in Germany, were any of the Baltics part of Germany at that point, post-World War Germany? I don't know how far east it extended, like where Prussia was up there. Did that go into the Baltics or no? No, I don't know. Okay, fuck you. I'm going to assume no. Back in Germany, Haas enrolled in a clandestine successor organization to his Free Corps, and in 1922, he joined in the brutal murder of a man he and his comrades believed was a Hasanabi spy in their ranks, communist spy in their ranks, beating him into a bloody mess with clubs, slitting his throat with a knife, and finishing him off with a revolver. Haas was arrested and imprisoned in the Brandenburg Penitentiary, where he learned, he later reported, the incorrigible nature of the criminal mind. Incorrigible, right? Incorrigible? Incorrigible. Nature of the criminal mind. He was shocked by the filthy, insolent language of his fellow prisoners and appalled at the way in which the prison had become a school for criminals instead of a place to reform them. Clean, neat, and tidy, and accustomed to discipline, Haas quickly became a model prisoner. The crude bullying and corruption of some of the wardens suggested to him that a more honest and more humane approach towards the prisoners might have had a good effect. But quite a few of his fellow inmates were, he concluded, absolutely beyond redemption. A few months before his arrest, he became a member of the Nazi Party. He was to spend most of the rest of the 1920s in jail, though, like many such men, he was released well before completing his sentence as a result of an agreement between the far left and far right deputies in the Reichstag to vote through a general amnesty for political prisoners. Clearly, however, when he was not in prison, the Nazi Party provided him with the discipline, order, and commitment he so obviously needed in life. One of Haas's associates in the murder was another member of the Rossbach Free Corps, Martin Bormann, born in 1900, son of a post office clerk and trained as a farm manager. During the war, he enrolled in the army, but was assigned to a garrison and saw no active service. However, like Haas, he found it impossible to fit into civilian life. He came into contact with the Free Corps through providing them with a base on the estate where he worked in Mecklenburg, as well as joining the Free... Okay, for all these guys that join like the stormtroopers and the Free Corps and all this shit, where the fuck are they getting money from? Do they work as well? Is this like a side hustle? Or how the fuck are these guys like earning a living and doing all these party politics and beating people up on the street and everything? Who the fuck is working here? The fuck? As well as joining the Free Corps, he also enrolled in an association against the arrogance of the Jews, another tiny and otherwise insignificant fringe group on the far right. Bormann was not as closely involved in the murder as Haas and only had to serve a year in jail. In February 1925, he was released, and by the end of 1926, he had become a full-time employee of the Nazi Party, carrying out myriad administrative tasks, first in Weimar, then in Munich. A hopelessly incompetent speaker and, unlike Haas, not constitutionally inclined to physical violence, Bormann became an expert on insurance for the party and its members, organized financial and other kinds of relief for brown shirts in distress, and slowly began to make himself indispensable to the movement. But the fact that he was, above all, an administrator cannot disguise the fanatical nature of his political commitment. Like Haas and so many others, he reacted to the defeat of Germany in the First World War by turning to the most extreme forms of resentful nationalism, rabid anti-Semitism, and hatred of parliamentary democracy. Quickly coming into contact with Hitler, he fell totally under his spell and soon began to impress the Nazi leader with his boundless, unconditional admiration and loyalty. To others in the party hierarchy, especially lower down the ranks, he could show an entirely different side, revealing in the process a brutal ambition that was eventually to make him one of the key figures in the Third Reich, above all in its later stages during the war. With men such as these, even more with slightly older figures who had gained their military experience through active service in the central battlefield of the war, in the central battlefields of the war, it was clear that the Free Corps were indeed, as has been said, the vanguard of Nazism, providing a good part of the leadership cadre of the party in the mid-1920s. Yet, already by this time, a younger generation was entering the party, the post-war generation, eager to emulate the now legendary exploits of the frontline soldiers. A few drifted over from the communists, attracted by political extremism, activism, and violence irrespective of ideology. I quit the party in 1929, reported one, because I could no longer agree with the orders from the Soviet Union. For this particular activist, however, violence was a way of life. He continued to attend party rallies of all descriptions and to throw himself into street fighting alongside his old comrades until a local Nazi leader offered him a position. Violence was like a drug for such men, as it clearly was for Rudolf Höss, too. Often, they had only the haziest notion of what they were fighting for. One young Nazi reported that witnessing opponents trying to break up a Nazi meeting made me instinctively a National Socialist, even before he became acquainted with the party's goals. Another, joining the Nazi movement in 1923, lived a life of almost incessantly violent activism, suffering beatings, stabbings, and arrests for the best part of a decade, as he recounted in detail in his autobiographical essay. These clashes, rather than the actual ideas of the movement, were what gave his life significance. For one young man, born in 1906 into a social democratic family, hostility to the communists was at the core of his commitment. The times he experienced in the unit of the stormtroopers, known as the Murderer's Storm, were, he later said, too wonderful and perhaps also too hard to write about. A particularly graphic, though by no means untypical account of stormtrooper activities was provided by a school teacher born in 1898 who had fought in the war and, after far-right activities in the early 1920s, joined the Nazis in 1929. He was called up one evening with his brown shirt group to defend a Nazi rally in a nearby town against the Reds. We all gathered at the entrance of the town and put on white armbands, and then you could hear the thundering marching of our column of about 250 men. Without weapons, without sticks, but with clenched fists, we marched in strict order and iron discipline into the catcalls and screaming of the crowds before the meeting hall. They had sticks and fence boards in their hands. It was 10 o'clock at night. With a few maneuvers in the middle of the street, we pushed the crowd against the walls to clear the street. Just at that moment, a carpenter drove through with a small truck and a black coffin in it. As he went by, one of us said, "Well, let's see whom we can put in there." The screams, cries, whistles, and howls grew ever more intense. The two rows of our column stood still, charged up with energy. A signal, and we go marching into the hall where a few hundred rioters are trying to shut up our speakers. We came just in time, marching in step along the walls until we had closed the ring around them, leaving an opening only at the entrance. A whistle sounds, we tighten the ring. 10 minutes later, we had put them out into the fresh air. The meeting goes on while outside all hell breaks loose. We then escorted the speaker back out, cutting once more through the swirling mob in closed formation. For this stormtrooper, the Marxists were the enemy, as they were for many ex-soldiers fighting in what he called the spirit of the frontline comradeship, risen from the smoke of the sacrificial vessels of the war and finding its way into the hearts of the awakened German people. Old fighters such as these proudly listed the injuries and insults they had received at the hands of their opponents. The persecution, harassment, scorn, and ridicule they had to suffer only stiffened their resolve. At one meeting in Eider Oberstein, according to a party activist, born in 1905, 400 stormtroopers turned up, including himself. One after the other, our four speakers had their say, interrupted by furious howling and catcalls. But when, in the ensuing discussion, an interlocutor was reprimanded for saying, "We don't want the brown plague in our beautiful town," tumultuous tumult broke out. There followed a battle with beer steins, chairs, and the like, and in 2 minutes the hall was demolished and everyone cleared out. We had to take back 7 heavily injured comrades that day, and there were rocks thrown at us and occasional assaults in spite of the police protection. Yet the depth of hatred and resentment which Nazi stormtroopers felt against the Social Democrats, as well as the Communists, can only be understood in terms of their feelings that they were under constant attack, not just from the Social Democrats' paramilitary affiliate, the Reichsbanner, but also in many areas from the police, who in Prussia, at least, were controlled by Social Democratic ministers such as Karl Severing and Albert Grzinski. The terror of police and government against us, as one stormtrooper put it, was another source of resentment against the Republic. Such men were outraged that they should be arrested for beating up or killing people they considered to be Germany's enemies, and blamed the prison sentences they sometimes had to suffer on the Marxist judicial authorities and the corruption of the Weimar Republic. Their hatred for the Reds was almost without measure. One young Nazi still inveighed in 1934 against the Red Blood, hordes of red mercenaries lurking in the dark, or, as another brown shirt put it, the red murder mob, the screaming, screeching hordes, hate-filled, furious faces worthy of study by a criminologist. Their hatred was fueled by countless clashes, all the way up to terrifying incidents, such as a notorious gun battle between communists and brown shirts that broke out on a train in Berlin-Lichtenfels on March 27, 1927. The brown shirts contrasted communist criminality with what they saw as their own selfless idealism. One stormtrooper reported with pride that the struggle of the late 1920s demanded financial as well as psychological sacrifices of every comrade. Night after night, leaflets for which we ourselves had to pay had to be distributed. Every month there was a rally, which always gave our little local branch of 5 to 10 members 60 marks of debts, since no innkeeper would rent us a hall without advance payment. The oft-repeated claim that many brown shirts only joined the organization because it offered them free food, drink, clothing, and accommodation, not to mention exciting and brutal kinds of entertainment, does scant justice to the fanaticism which motivated many of them. Only the oldest activists joined in the expectation of getting a job or receiving financial support. For the young, it did not matter so much. Nazi student leaders often got themselves deeply into debt by paying personally for posters and pamphlets. With many others, it must have been the same. Of course, testimonies such as these, addressed to an American sociologist, were bound to emphasize the self-sacrifice and dedication of their writers. Nevertheless, it is difficult to grasp the full extent of the stormtroopers' fanaticism and hatred unless we accept that they often did feel they were making sacrifices for their cause. Hitler himself drew attention to this when he told an audience in January of 1932 not to forget that it is a sacrifice when today many hundreds of thousands of men of the National Socialist movement climb onto trucks every day, protect meetings, put on marches, sacrifice night after night, and return only at daybreak, and then either back to the workshop and factory or out to collect their pittance as unemployed. When they buy their uniforms, their shirts, their badges, and even pay their own transportation from what little they have, believe me, that is already a sign of the power of an ideal, a great ideal. Oh, I guess that's how they got their money. Okay. Yikes. Actual simps. The Nazi Party depended on such commitment. Much of its power and dynamism came from the fact that it was not dependent on big business or bureaucratic institutions, such as trade unions for its financial support, as the bourgeois parties and the Social Democrats to varying degrees were, still less on the secret subsidies of a foreign power, along the lines of the Moscow-financed communists. Many people were won over to Nazism by Hitler's demagogy. Now presented in dramatically staged mass rallies and huge open-air meetings, Hitler's speeches at the end of the 1920s had a power greater than ever before. One young nationalist born in 1908 had attended meetings addressed by such luminaries of the extreme right as Hugenberg and Ludendorff before he finally found inspiration when he heard the leader Adolf Hitler speak in person. After this, there was only one thing for me, either to win with Adolf Hitler or to die with him, or to die for him. This is the support I need from you guys, by the way, okay? The personality of the leader had me totally in its spell. He who gets to know Adolf Hitler with a pure and true heart will love him with all his heart. He will love him not for the sake of materialism, but for Germany. There are many other such testimonies from an anti-Semitic metalworker born in 1903 who discovered at a Hitler meeting in 1927 that our leader radiates a power which makes us all strong. to another stormtrooper born in 1907 who declared that he fell under Hitler's spell in 1929 in Nuremberg, how his blue eyes sparkled when his stormtroopers marched past him in the light of the torches, an endless sea of flames rippling through the streets of the ancient Reich capital. Much of the Nazis' appeal lay in their promise to end the political divisions that had plagued Germany throughout the Weimar Republic. One 18-year-old clerk attending rallies at a regional election in 1929 was impressed by the Nazi speaker's sincere commitment to the German people as a whole, whose greatest misfortune was being divided into so many parties and classes. Finally, a practical proposal for the renewal of the people. Destroy the parties, do away with classes, true national community. These were goals to which I could commit myself without reservation. Relatively few, in the end, were converted to active participation in the movement by reading political or ideological tracts. Word of mouth was what counted. Yet, not everyone was mesmerized by Hitler's speaking. A serious and idealistic young middle-class Nazi, like Melita Maschmann, for example, admired him as a man of the people who had risen from obscurity, but even at the annual party rally, she was so busy, as she wrote later, that I could not permit myself the debauchery of ecstatic rapture. Parades and shows she found boring and pointless. For her, Nazism was more a patriotic ideal than a cult of the individual leader. For Nazism's middle-class supporters, especially, perhaps women, street violence was often something to be grudgingly tolerated or studiously ignored. Many such people came only hesitantly to Nazism. Even joining the party often denoted a level of commitment far lower than that of the young brown shirts interviewed by Theodore Abel. A substantial proportion of the party's members left after only a relatively short time in its ranks. Nevertheless, by the early 1930s, it was beginning to extend its appeal beyond the lower middle class that had provided its backbone since its foundation. Always anxious to claim working-class support, party officials frequently classified members as workers when in reality they were something else. Detailed local investigations have shown that the standard accounts of party membership, based on an internal party census of 1935, have portrayed the working class element as anything up to twice what it actually was, namely about 10% in Germany's second city, Hamburg, 10 years earlier in 1925. Have you read Rawls? He is one of the best liberals. Finally, you cannot be a liberal now, as Zizek says. Trump was born from a failure of liberalism. Yeah, dude, I've read every Rawls book. He's my favorite guy ever. Oh my God. Wage earners also seem to have been the social group most prone to leave the party, and therefore the least likely to show up in the 1935 figures on which most calculations are based. But Hamburg was a traditional center of the labor movement, whose strength made it difficult for the Nazis to make any inroads. Is Hamburg where hamburgers came from? Is that like an actual thing? Or is it just a coincidence? In parts of Saxony, where the labor movement was weaker and traditional small-scale industries gave the economy a very different shape to the modern, highly rationalized industrial centers, such as Berlin or the Ruhr, manual wage laborers accounted for a higher proportion of party members. Younger workers, who had not joined a union because they had never had a job, were particularly susceptible to the appeal of the Nazi Party in Saxony. As many as a third of Nazi Party members in the province may have belonged to the working class in a basic economic sense in the late 1920s. The lower middle class in town and country remained heavily overrepresented in comparison to its numbers in the population as a whole. By the early 1930s, however, the proportion of middle and upper class party members in the Saxon Nazi Party was increasing as the party became more respectable. Slowly, the Nazis were escaping their modest and humble roots and beginning to attract members of Germany's social elites. Whoops. Among the new generation of leading Nazis who entered the movement in the mid-1920s, one man was to play a particularly prominent role in the Third Reich. At first sight, few would have considered that Heinrich Himmler, born in Munich on October 7, 1900, was destined to reach any kind of prominence at all. His father was a Catholic schoolteacher of sufficiently conservative views to have been considered fit to give private tuition to a young member of the Bavarian royal family for a time in the 1890s. Coming from a respectable background in the educated middle class, Heinrich, a sickly child with poor eyesight, went through several different schools, but received what appeared to be a solid academic education at grammar school in Munich and Landshut? I think, right? What are you guys doing? Okay. A school friend, Georg Halgarten, who later became a well-known left-wing historian, testified to Himmler's intelligence and ability. School reports described Himmler as a conscientious, hard-working, ambitious, able, and well-mannered student, a model pupil in every way. His patriotic father, however, made strenuous efforts to get him into the army, even declaring himself willing to cut short his son's education in order to do this. Young Heinrich's diaries and reading notes show how strongly he imbibed the mythology of 1914, the idea of war as the summit of human achievement, and the concept of struggle as the moving force of human history and human existence. But he only got as far as training in the cadets and never saw action on the front line. Here was a particularly clear example of a man of the post-front generation who bitterly regretted not having been able to fight in the war and spent much of his later life trying to make good this crucial absence in his early life. After passing the school, leaving examination with flying colors, Himmler, following his father's advice, went on to study agriculture at the Technical High School in Munich, and here, too, he excelled, graduating with a mark of very good in 1922. He also joined a dueling fraternity, and after some trouble in finding a swordsman who took him seriously enough to accept a challenge, duly acquired the obligatory facial scars. In the meantime, however, he joined Kahr's Denizens Defense Force, and then fell under the influence of Ernst Röhm, who impressed him with his military zeal. The far-right milieu into which he had now plunged directed him towards revolutionary anti-Semitism, and by 1924, he was inveighing against the hydra of the Black and Red International of Jews and ultramontanism. Damn, they already hated Montana. Of Freemasons and Jesuits, of the spirit of commerce and cowardly bourgeois. With his large head, his short back and sides, his putting basin haircut, round glasses, receding chin, and pencil mustache, Himmler looked very much like the schoolmaster his father had been, not at all like a fanatical nationalist street fighter. A few months later, he brandished a standard rather than a pistol when he joined a unit of Röhm's Reich war flag group that briefly occupied the Bavarian War Ministry in the first phase of the abortive Munich PUTSCH. Fuck, I keep fucking this word up. On the 8th or 9th of November. Hold on.
PUTSCH.
Putsch. Himmler got away from the putsch without being arrested, and so had his opportunity to rise in the movement at a time when Hitler was in prison or banned from speaking, and the Nazi Party was in disarray. He hitched his wagon, wisely at this date, to Gregor Strasser's Rising Star, becoming first his secretary, then deputy regional leader in 2 different districts, and deputy Reich propaganda leader. But he was not Strasser's disciple, for by this time he had fallen under Hitler's spell, less through a reading of Mein Kampf, My Struggle, on which he recorded some critical notes. The first chapters, on his own youth, contain many weak points. Then through personal contacts to his various official capacities, which included, of course, attending Hitler's speeches. To the young Himmler, still only in his mid-20s and hopelessly adrift in the choppy seas of post-Putsch paramilitary politics, Hitler offered certainty, a leader to admire, a cause to follow. From 1925 onwards, when he joined the newly reconstituted Nazi Party, Himmler developed a boundless hero worship of the Nazi leader. He kept a portrait of Hitler on his office wall, and is even on occasion said to have engaged it in conversation. In 1926, he married, and his wife, 7 years older than he was, influenced him strongly in the direction of occultism, herbalism, homeopathy, and other unconventional beliefs, some of which he was later to try and force on his subordinates. Although Himmler's marriage did not prosper, these ideas did. Gradually abandoning the conventional Catholic piety of his youth, he became an enthusiast for blood and soil, joining the Undermines, a nationalist settlement group to which Rudolf Haas also belonged. Here, Himmler came under the influence of Richard Walther Duray, an enthusiast for Nordic racial ideas. Duray, born in Argentina in 1895 and educated, somewhat incongruously, in Wimbledon, England, had served in the German army during the war. Then he had become a specialist in selective animal breeding, which led him into the politics of blood and soil, though not immediately into the Nazi Party. Himmler imbibed from Duray. Is it Duray? a fixed belief in the destiny of the Nordic race, the superiority of its blood over that of the Slavs, the need to keep its blood pure, and the central role of a solid German peasantry in ensuring the future of the Germanic race. Driven by this obsession with the peasantry, Himmler for a while himself took up farming, but he did not do well, since he spent too much time in political campaigning, and the times were in any case bad for agricultural business. On January 6, 1929, Hitler appointed the faithful Himmler as head of his personal protection formation, Schutzstaffel, quickly known by its initials as the SS. This had its origins in a small unit formed early in 1923 to act as Hitler's bodyguard and protect the party headquarters. It was refounded in 1925 when Hitler realized that the brown shirts under Rome would never show him the unconditional loyalty which he required. As though I have tier 5 subs. Its initial commander was Julius Schreck, commander of the Brown Shirts assault squad before Hitler's imprisonment, and from the first it was conceived as an elite formation, in contrast to the catch-all mass paramilitary movement of the Brown Shirts. In the intra-party intrigues of the mid-1920s, the SS went through a number of leaders, all of whom failed to assert its independence from the growing power of the Brown Shirts, though they did manage to build it up as a closely disciplined, tightly knit core of men. Himmler succeeded where they had failed. Despite the rough elements who had formed its first group of recruits, he self-consciously set out to create it as a real elite, bringing in former army officers like the Pomeranian aristocrat Erich von dem Zalewski, and Free Corps veterans such as Friedrich Karl, Baron von Eberstein. Okay. That's the same person? Friedrich Karl, Baron von Eberstein? Inheriting a formation of just 290 men, Himmler had increased the strength of the SS to 1,000 by the end of 1929 and nearly 3,000 a year later. Over the objections of the Brown Shirt leadership, he persuaded Hitler to make the SS fully independent in 1930, giving it a new uniform, black instead of brown, and a new, strictly hierarchical, quasi-military structure. As discontent and impatience rose within the Brown Shirt organization and the threat of independent action grew, Hitler turned the SS into a kind of internal party police. It became more secretive, began collecting confidential information, not only on the party's enemies, but on leading members of the Brown Shirts as well. With the creation of the SS, the basic structure of the Nazi movement was complete. By the end of the 1920s, Hitler had emerged, partly through circumstances, partly through his own speaking ability and his own ruthlessness, partly through the desperate need of the extreme right for a strong leader, as the unquestioned dictator of the movement, the object of a rapidly growing cult of personality. There were still tensions within the movement. These were to surface dramatically in the following few years up to 1934. There were still people in leading positions, such as Strasser in Rome, who were prepared to criticize Hitler and take a different line from his if they thought it necessary. But Hitler had built up around him a crucial group of men whose devotion to him was wholly unconditional. Men like Goebbels, Göring, Hess, Himmler, Rosenberg, Schirach, I don't know how to pronounce his name, and Streicher. Under their leadership, and thanks to Strasser's organizational talent, the Nazi movement by the middle of 1929 had become an elaborate, well-organized political body whose appeal was directed to virtually every sector of the population. Its propaganda was becoming rapidly more sophisticated. Its paramilitary wing was taking on the communist Red Front fighters and Social Democratic Reichsbanner in the streets. Its internal police force, the SS, was poised to take action against the dissident and the disobedient in its own ranks. It had acquired, modified, and elaborated a crude, largely unoriginal but fanatically held ideology centered on extreme nationalism, hate-filled anti-Semitism, and contempt for Weimar democracy. It was determined to gain power on the basis of popular support at the polls and rampaging violence on the streets, then tear up the peace treaties of 1919, rearm, reconquer the lost territories in East and West, and create living space for ethnic German colonization of East Central and Eastern Europe. The cult of violence, derived not least from the Free Corps, was at the heart of the movement. By 1929, it could be seen in operation on a daily basis on the streets. The Nazi movement despised the law and made no secret of its belief that might was right. It had also evolved a way of diverting legal responsibility from the party leadership for acts of violence and lawlessness committed by brown shirts and other elements within the movement. For Hitler, Goebbels, the regional leaders, and the rest only gave orders couched in rhetoric that, while violent, was also vague. Their subordinates would understand clearly what was being hinted at and go into action straight away. This tactic helped persuade a growing number of middle and even some upper-class Germans that Hitler and his immediate subordinates were not really responsible for the bloodshed by the brown shirts on the streets, in barroom brawls, and in rowdy meetings, an impression strengthened by the repeated insistence of the brown shirt leaders that they were acting independently of the Nazi party bosses. By 1929, Hitler had attracted the support, sympathy, and to some extent, even the financial backings of some well-connected people, especially in Bavaria. And his movement had extended its operations across the whole country, attracting significant electoral support, above all among crisis-racked small farmers in Protestant areas of North Germany and Franconia. Franconia? None of this could disguise the fact, however, that in the autumn of 1929, the Nazi Party was still very much on the fringes of politics. With only a handful of deputies in the Reichstag, it had to compete with a number of other fringe organizations of the right, some of which, for example, the self-styled Economy Party, what a cringe name for a political party, were larger and better supported than it was itself, and all of these still paled into insignificance in comparison to mainstream organizations of the right, such as the Nationalist Party and the Steel Helmets. Moreover, although they did not command the support of a majority of the electorate anymore, the three parties that were the mainstay of Weimar democracy, the Social Democrats, the Center Party, and the Democrats, were still in government, in a grand coalition that also included the party of Germany's long-serving, moderate, and highly successful foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann. The Republic seemed to have weathered the storms of the early 1920s, the inflation, the French occupation, the armed conflicts, the social dislocation, and to have entered calmer waters. It would need a catastrophe of major dimensions if an extremist party like the Nazis was to gain mass support. In 1929, with the sudden collapse of the economy in the wake of the stock exchange crash in New York, it came.